Beneath the ruins of war, the Nazis weren't just chasing victory, they were hunting secrets, ancient relics, lost civilizations, forbidden powers whispered in forgotten tongues. From the frozen wastes of Antarctica to the burning sands of Egypt, they searched for the keys to immortality, godhood, and world domination. This is not conspiracy theory. This is the nightmare archaeology of the Third Reich. 50 ancient mysteries, one race against time. Welcome to the darkest treasure hunt in history. This is what the Nazis were really looking for. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button to join the journey into history's darkest corners. This series is just getting started, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. And hey, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? What time is it right now in your part of the world? Midnight in Manila? Sunrise in Stockholm? Let's light up the timeline with a global roll call. All right, you ready? Because the Nazis weren't just rewriting history. They were digging underneath it. The Holy Grail. It wasn't just a cup. It was the cup. The one said to have caught Christ's blood at the crucifixion. The one that disappeared into legend, trailing centuries of whispered quests, coded parchments, and dead men clutching riddles. For the Nazi regime, high on myth, arrogance, and a pharmaceutical cocktail of delusions, it was more than an artifact. It was a weapon. Heinrich Himmler, the Reich's high priest of the occult, was obsessed, not in a hobbyist way, in a let's spend real government money and human lives trying to find this thing way. He believed the Grail wasn't just a relic. He believed it was a battery, a divine capacitor, a conduit for an ancient, unbroken current of cosmic power, one that could supercharge the Aryan bloodline and make the Third Reich eternal. And so, deep in the shadowy chambers of the SS, amid rune-etched stone and the stink of ambition, the quest began. The Holy Grail wasn't just sought in monasteries and mountain caves. The Nazis ransacked archives, bribed monks, translated lost texts, and sent scholars turned spies into the teeth of war zones. They read Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, not as literature, but as GPS coordinates. They thought the Grail was real, buried, hidden maybe in the Pyrenees, or buried beneath a Cathar stronghold like Montsegur, a fortress turned tomb brimming with blood-soaked secrets and the last breaths of heretics who might have died protecting it. Enter Otto Rahn, an academic with a flair for the dramatic and the kind of reckless obsession that makes you ideal for an occult-obsessed death cult masquerading as a political party. Rahn's writings were steeped in Gnosticism, Cathar lore, and Grail mysticism. Himmler read his books like scripture. He was dispatched to France to dig not just into the ground, but into centuries of silence. He wandered the Languedoc, slept in caves, interviewed villagers who thought he was insane, and nearly froze to death chasing phantoms. He claimed to find signs, inscriptions, echoes, but not the Grail itself. That didn't matter to Himmler. In 1937, Rahn was inducted into the SS, black uniform, skull badge, the whole terrifying ensemble. It wasn't an honor, it was ownership. Rahn soon realized the machine he'd fed was hungry for more than myth. It wanted results. It wanted the Grail, or at least a convincing enough lie. By 1939, Rahn was dead, officially suicide, unofficially silenced. The Reich didn't tolerate disappointments. Still, the myth burned. Himmler, undeterred, turned Welsburg Castle into a Grail temple. The castle's northern tower was redesigned to serve as the symbolic center of the world, its floor inlaid with the infamous black Suna sigil of hidden knowledge and deathless power. This wasn't just architecture. This was ritual space, a psychogeographic weapon, a sacred chamber for when the Grail was finally retrieved and enthroned. But it never came. All the cryptic maps, all the looted libraries, all the money, blood, and fanatical hope, and still the cup refused to appear. Whether because it never existed, or because it couldn't be possessed by hands drenched in genocide, remains a mystery. One the Nazis died still believing could be solved. And yet their failure didn't kill the idea. The Holy Grail still haunts fringe seekers and conspiracy theorists. It still stirs in Vatican vault rumors, in Dan Brown paperbacks, in the longing for some ancient purity to cleanse the sins of modernity. But the Nazis didn't want to be cleansed. They wanted to be gods. Which brings us to the next artifact in their demented treasure hunt, a box of divine fire, capable of flattening cities with the breath of angels. They believed it had once parted oceans. They believed it could do so again, if only they could find it. The Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant. To understand the Nazi obsession with the Ark of the Covenant, you have to understand this. They weren't just trying to win a war. They were trying to rewrite the rules of reality. And in their warped theology of blood and fire, the Ark wasn't a relic, it was a reactor. Imagine a gold-plated chest, built to precise dimensions, carried on poles by Levites who had to avoid touching it or die. A box that once made Jericho fall, that radiated a divine presence so lethal it killed the curious on contact. It was the biblical equivalent of a tactical nuke, and the Nazis wanted it in their hands. The Ark had vanished from recorded history sometime after the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, but absence only made the myth grow louder. It whispered from the shadows of every apocryphal text and fringe theory, and to the Reich, those whispers were coordinates. The An-Nenner-Betha SS's occult brain trust began assembling a roadmap, a jigsaw puzzle made of scripture, temple schematics, and half-mad prophecy. Heinrich Himmler pored over ancient Hebrew texts with the cold curiosity of a man dissecting a soul. He didn't want to understand the God of Israel. He wanted to hack him. They looked toward Ethiopia, where legends claim the Ark had been taken and hidden in Axum, guarded for centuries by monks who had sworn never to leave its side. Nazi agents filtered through Africa, some under diplomatic cover, others using the Luftwaffe's growing footprint in the region. They never made it to the Ark. Not because it wasn't there, but because even the Nazis had limits to their reach. For now, then came the idea of reconstructing the Ark. Not finding it, rebuilding it. They theorized that the Ark's true power came not from what was inside, but from its designates, proportions, its materials, its ancient frequencies. Some believed it was a capacitor, harnessing the electrical charge between the cherubim on its lid. Tesla, naturally, got dragged into these theories posthumously. Others thought it was an alien machine, and that Moses was the first human to receive advanced technology directly from beings not of this earth, Aryans, perhaps from the stars. If that sounds like bad science fiction, welcome to the Nazi occult project. In the catacombs beneath Wuhlsburg Castle, SS engineers and mystics ran dark experiments. They modeled electromagnetic devices based on Ark blueprints, attempting to recreate what they believed was a mechanism of divine energy. Some reports buried in post-war intelligence documents speak of sudden power surges, unexplainable deaths, and an entire sublevel sealed off after the incident. But the real prize remained elusive. The Ark was not found in Axum, not in Jerusalem, not buried beneath Temple Mount, or stashed in a Vatican sub-basement. It didn't appear on any of the thousands of maps, scrolls, or stolen artifacts the Nazis smuggled back to Berlin. And still they kept looking, because for them, the Ark represented control over something far greater than the battlefield. It was domination over the divine, the ability to annihilate not just armies, but entire histories, to replace sacred memory with blood-stamped propaganda. But while they stared into the scriptures and ransacked the world, the Ark remained silent, which drove them further, beyond the lands of men, beyond religion, into the myths that predate civilization. Because if the Ark was too holy, too Hebrew, too beyond their twisted reach, maybe they'd do better with something older, something not sanctified, but hidden. Something buried beneath the ice and rock of forgotten peaks. So they turned east, toward the Himalayas, toward Tibet, toward the legend of a secret kingdom untouched by time, guarded by monks who never died. Shambala. Shambala, Agartha. The Nazis didn't just want to win the war. They wanted to rewrite what it meant to be human. And to do that, they needed more than weapons. They needed revelation. Q. Shambala. A lost city. A hidden kingdom. Somewhere deep in the Himalayas, according to Tibetan lore, lies a place untouched by war, rot, or decay. A place where death isn't an ending, but an inconvenience. A sanctuary of enlightened beings who've mastered the forces of the universe and guard a library of knowledge older than time. They call it Shambala, or sometimes Agartha. The names shift depending on who you ask, but the promise is the same: access to a divine intelligence, a spiritual nuclear reactor. The Nazis thought it was real, and more than that, they thought it belonged to them. In 1938, Himmler greenlit one of the strangest expeditions in the history of the Third Reich, the SS Tibet expedition led by zoologist-turned-occultist Ernst Schaefer. Officially, they were there to study plants, animals, and racial origins. Unofficially, they were hunting for the entrance to Shambala. The team landed in British India under diplomatic pretense, made their way into Tibet, and set up shop. They measured skulls, photographed faces, bought sacred relics. Not like respectful guests, more like burglars casing a temple. They were obsessed with Tibetan cosmology, scouring monasteries for ancient maps that might point to underground realms or secret doors carved into the mountainside. They believed Shambhala was the capital of a hidden world, a spiritual engine room where immortal Aryans retreated when the surface world became too impure. And in the deeper corners of Nazi esotericism, there was an even stranger belief that the monks of Tibet were not just spiritual elites but distant Aryan cousins, survivors of a great cataclysm who'd taken refuge in Agartha, deep within the Earth's crust, waiting to reclaim their birthright. It gets weirder. Some Nazi theorists insisted that Shambhala was accessible through hidden tunnels, perhaps beneath the Himalayas, or via the North Pole, or even under Antarctica. More on that madness later. Others claimed the entrance was spiritual, not physical, that only the racially pure could access it through ritual, vibration, or trance. And yes, they tried those too. SS operatives attempted to channel messages from Shambhala. There are documents suggesting seances, breathing exercises, even the use of sound frequencies in darkened chambers to trigger astral projection. They were trying to call the city, like it was a customer service hotline for cosmic fascists. The results? Inconclusive, but the damage? Profound. Their contact with Tibetan leaders destabilized already fragile political tensions. Artifacts were stolen, sacred texts disappeared into crates marked with swastikas. Monks who resisted the Nazi intrusion were neutralized. And back in Germany, the materials were funneled into Welsburg and the Ahnenerbe's growing archive of mystical garbage. But why did they care so much? Because Shambhala, to them, wasn't just a place, it was a mirror. A reflection of the world they were trying to build, a secret civilization of enlightened, long-lived beings guarding ultimate truth. A perfect, hierarchical society where the few rule the many with divine right. It was Nazi ideology dressed in monk robes. And if they could find it, if they could prove it, they could say, "Look, our madness is truth. Even the ancients agree." They didn't find it, of course, because it doesn't exist, at least not in the way they imagined. But that didn't stop them. Because if Shambhala wasn't the source of the Aryan race, maybe it was just a pit stop. Maybe the real origin, the cradle of their mythic bloodline, was even older, even bigger. Maybe it was under the sea. Atlantis. Atlantis. It started with Plato, a throwaway allegory in Timaeus and Critias about a doomed civilization wiped off the face of the earth in a single night of fire and flood. Atlantis, an ancient superpower that grew too proud, too decadent, and got the divine axe. For most of history, it was a philosophical parable, a cautionary tale. But to the Nazis, it was a treasure map. They didn't just believe Atlantis was real, they believed it was the origin point of the so-called Aryan race, a godlike civilization of tall, fair-skinned beings with advanced technology and spiritual mastery who scattered across the globe after the cataclysm, seeding every high culture from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. Egyptians, Greeks, Norsemen, they were all, in the Nazi version of history, just faded echoes of Atlantean greatness. And guess who the purest descendants were? Yep, Germans. This wasn't archaeology. It was racial mythology. Weaponized pseudoscience. Ahnenerbe agents scoured maps and myths, looking for any whisper that might prove their cosmic ancestry. They dug through Old Norse sagas, Hindu scriptures, and even Mayan carving, cherry-picking anything that hinted at a world-spanning superculture that sounded vaguely blonde. Atlantis became the ideological Rosetta Stone, the missing link that explained why the Nazis believed they had a divine right to rule. If they could find the remains of this proto-Aryan super-civilization, its temples, its tech, its secrets, they could claim not only superiority, but seniority. They could say, "We were first, we were best, we were gods." But where was Atlantis? Some Nazi theorists, like Edgar Dacqué, claimed it lay in the North Sea, somewhere between Britain and Scandinavia, what they dubbed Thule or Hyperoreia. We'll get to that lunacy soon. Others pointed to the Azores, the Sahara, even Antarctica. Himmler believed it might be under the ice cap, preserved in glacial suspension like some Nazi wet dream of cryogenic resurrection. There were expeditions, real ones. Ahnenerbe-backed explorers like Edmund Kiss claimed that ancient Andean ruins, particularly Tiwanaku in Bolivia, were the remnants of Atlantean outposts. Kiss didn't just flirt with pseudoscience, she practically dry-humped it. He believed Nordic supermen colonized South America millions of years ago. That's not a joke. Millions. He proposed pre-glacial architecture, Aryan migration across ancient land bridges, and that the indigenous myths of white gods were distorted memories of Atlantean conquerors. He published it all, and the Reich took him seriously. Back in Germany, Welsburg Castle was again repurposed, not just as a Grail sanctuary, but as an Atlantean temple. Murals were painted to depict the fall of Atlantis and the rebirth of the Aryan order. Floors were carved with symbols that blended Greek myth, Nordic rune, and SS ideology. They believed they were not just heirs but recreators. They would finish what Atlantis had started. Only this time, there would be no fall. And when they couldn't find Atlantis, they invented it. Nazi scientists fabricated maps, doctored photos, and wrote faux archaeological reports to fill the void. They created a new Atlantis not buried beneath the sea, but beneath lies so dense they passed for history. A propaganda Atlantis, a blueprint for the world they wanted to build, pure, orderly, merciless. But buried beneath all this was something darker. A truth even the Nazis wouldn't admit. Atlantis was a story of hubris, of a civilization so obsessed with power it drowned in its own ambition. Plato meant it as a warning. The Nazis treated it like a prophecy. And if Atlantis was a civilization swallowed by water, maybe there was another, frozen in ice. Maybe not in the Atlantic, but in the far north, a land of eternal light. An ancient homeland untouched by time. Hyperoreia, Hyperoreia. At the edge of the ancient world map, where the sun never sets and men live 1,000 years, lies Hyperoreia. At least, that's how the Greeks described it. A mythical northern paradise, untouched by war, disease, or decay, a utopia where gods walked among mortals and time stood still. To most historians, Hyperoreia is poetic fantasy. To the Nazis, it was an address. They believed Hyperoreia was real. More than that, it was sacred. A lost cradle of pure Aryan civilization, predating Egypt, Sumer, and every known empire. It was the Alfaith, beginning of a bloodline destined to rule. For the Nazi myth architects, this frozen Eden became the cornerstone of their racial theology, and they needed to find it. Enter Hans Rübiger's Welteslareth, world ice theory, a glorious blend of bad physics and worse cosmology. This theory argued that the universe was shaped by cosmic ice. Stars were frozen orbs. Planets formed from giant blocks of space ice colliding. History itself, according to this icy gospel, was a cycle of catastrophe-holed moons crashing into Earth, resetting civilization like a frosty etch-a-sketch. Why does this matter? Because according to the theory's followers, Hyperoreia was destroyed by one of these lunar apocalypses. The Aryans, once living in polar paradise, were forced south by a cosmic cataclysm. The survivors spread across the globe, establishing every major ancient civilization and losing bits of their original perfection along the way. The Nazis ate it up. They embraced this glacial nonsense because it offered something that archaeology never could, a myth that made them chosen. It cast them not as conquerors, but as returners, the rightful heirs of a forgotten golden age. A people not just superior in the present, but cosmically ordained since the dawn of time. So where was Hyperoreia? The theory spiraled out of control. Some claimed it was in the Arctic, hidden beneath miles of polar ice. Others placed it in northern Europe, Scandinavia, or even the island of Heligoland. A few believed in subterranean Hyperoreia, accessible through the hollow earth. Don't worry, we'll get there. And of course, there were those who tied it to Atlantis, insisting the two were twin empires, or perhaps one and the same lost in different directions. The Ahnenerbe sponsored expeditions to the north. Real men, with real guns and real funding, wandered into the Arctic wastes searching for ruins beneath the snow. They studied Icelandic sagas, Sami folklore, and prehistoric cave markings, trying to triangulate a continent that never existed. And in the Wellsberg crypts, the SS created rituals to connect with their imagined Hyperborean ancestors. They believed the ancient blood still flowed in their veins, that through meditation, rune magic, and sacred geometry, they could remember not metaphorically, but literally what had been lost. They weren't digging for ruins, they were digging for identity, a mythic memory, a racial Eden. Of course, the madness didn't stop there. Hyperoreia became the launchpad for even wilder theories. That the gods of Norse myth were Hyperboreans. That Jesus was a Hyperborean sage. That the swastika was a solar symbol beamed down from Hyperborean UFOs. Yes, really. It was a rabbit hole lined with frostbite and fascism. And in the center of it all was Heinrich Himmler, part bureaucrat, part wizard, orchestrating the myth machine like a conductor on meth. For him, Hyperoreia wasn't just propaganda, it was revelation. It was the spiritual GPS guiding the SS toward their destiny, not just political dominance, but cosmic dominion. But what if Hyperoreia wasn't enough? What if they needed proof, something tangible, something held in a hand, forged in myth, and soaked in blood? Something that could kill a god or make one. The Spear of Destiny. The Spear of Destiny. Lance of Longinus. It was just a spear. A jagged iron tip mounted on a splintering shaft displayed behind glass in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. Tourists walked past it every day without blinking. But to Adolf Hitler, it wasn't a relic. It was destiny, sharpened to a point. The Spear of Destiny, also known as the Holy Lance, was believed to be the weapon that pierced the side of Christ as he hung on the cross. According to Christian legend, it became imbued with unimaginable power. Whoever held it, the stories went, would hold the fate of the world. The Nazis, naturally, took that literally. In 1912, a young, broke, and directionless Hitler stood before the spear in Vienna. He stared at it for hours. He later told close associates that in that moment, he felt something. A force. A calling. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, one of Hitler's first official acts before speeches, before parades was to take possession of the spear. It was moved to Nuremberg under heavy guard. It wasn't just a trophy, it was a talisman. Heinrich Himmler and the Ahnenerbe seized on the spear's legend with ravenous devotion. They didn't just believe it had historical significance, they believed it was a spiritual circuit breaker. A divine weapon that conferred invincibility. They pored over medieval chronicles, crusader myths, and Gnostic texts, trying to decode its supposed power. The Nazis weren't the first to fixate on the spear. Charlemagne supposedly carried it into battle. So did Frederick Barbarossa. Napoleon reportedly tried to acquire it. Each time the spear changed hands, empires rose or fell, and Hitler, obsessed with patterns, believed he'd found his own Excalibur. But there was a problem. No one could prove it was the spear. Multiple claimants existed Don in Armenia, one in the Vatican, another in Krakow. The Nazi regime declared their version authentic through sheer willpower and backed it with ceremony. The SS crafted a mythology around it. They built a sanctum for it beneath Nuremberg, lit with flickering torchlight and decorated with runes, where officers swore oaths to the Reich in its presence. Some account chaff whispers buried in post-war files suggest that Himmler ordered scientific tests on the spear, metallurgy, X-rays, even occult rituals. Nothing confirmed divine power. But the belief was enough. They didn't need it to work. They just needed it to mean something. And to Hitler, it meant everything. He kept it close. Symbolically, if not always physically. It was his reassurance that he was chosen, that history bent toward him. That failure was impossible. Until it wasn't. On the 30th of April, 1945, the day Hitler killed himself in his Berlin bunker, the Americans seized Nuremberg and with it, the Spear of Destiny. Hours later, the war effectively ended. The myth snapped in two. The spear lost its fangs. Or maybe, it never had them. Even today, the legend lingers. Conspiracy theorists claim the real spear was switched, that it's hidden in some alpine vault, that its power is sleeping, waiting to be reawakened by another warlord with enough ego and esotericism to try again. But the Nazis didn't just want a single weapon. They wanted to trace a lineage, a divine thread from ancient gods to modern tanks. They needed evidence that the Aryan race wasn't just strong, it was primordial, global, etched into the bones of the earth. So they turned their gaze even further back, beyond the Holy Land, beyond the ice, beyond Atlantis. They went hunting for the origins of their imaginary ancestors. Ancient Aryan origins. Ancient Aryan origins. The Nazis didn't want to conquer the world. They wanted to inherit it. To do that, they needed a creation myth, a grand origin story where the so-called Aryan race didn't just appear, they descended. Chosen, divine. Prehistoric superheroes who taught the rest of the world how to walk, speak, build, and worship. And when the world got too corrupt, too impure, they vanished waiting for the right moment to return and reclaim what was theirs. This wasn't just a fringe belief. This was the foundation of Nazi ideology. The Ahnenerbe Third Reich's brain trust for pseudo-history and esoteric science was tasked with rewriting human evolution. Their mission: find archaeological proof that the Aryans were the original humans. The master builders. The spark that lit civilization's fire. What they actually found: rocks, bones, the usual stuff. What they said they found: everything. Let's talk about their process. First, they defined Aryan however they wanted. Tall, blonde, skull shape like a geometry lesson gone wrong. Then, they sent teams to excavate anywhere that might yield evidence, even if it didn't. Scandinavia, Iran, the Caucasus, the Himalayas. If a site had ruins and enough silence to invent a myth, it qualified. Every artifact became proof. A rune on a rock? Clearly Proto-Germanic. A burial site? Obviously an Aryan chieftain. Skulls were measured with calipers, noses catalogued like museum pieces, jawlines scrutinized like sacred texts. Science wasn't just bent, it was broken and forged into a weapon. They called it ancestral heritage. What it was in truth was ancestral theft. Take the Indus Valley, home to one of the world's oldest civilizations, rich in art, architecture, and undeciphered scripts. Some Nazi theorists claim the Aryans invaded this region thousands of years ago, bringing culture and order to the chaos of native peoples. A blatant misreading of both history and linguistics. But hey, if the swastika's in the ruins, it must mean they were German, right? Spoiler. That's not how symbols work. The swastika, by the way, appeared in dozens of ancient cultures, from Hinduism to Native American art. But to the Nazis, this was proof of a global Aryan diaspora. Their theory: the ancient Aryans spread out after some world-shaking catastrophe, Atlantis, Hyperoreia, take your pick, and planted the seeds of civilization everywhere they went. Egypt, Aryan. Sumeria, Aryan. Mesoamerica, somehow Aryan. The arrogance was cosmic. And it got more insane with every expedition. In the Caucasus, Nazi anthropologists claimed to find the missing link between Nordic Europeans and ancient Persians. In Tibet, they measured monks' skulls to find commonality with Germans. In Bolivia, they looked at Tiwanaku's stonework and concluded it was built by Atlantean Aryans. Because obviously, brown people couldn't stack rocks like that without divine help. It was a religion, a cult of racial nostalgia, and Himmler was its high priest. He believed that buried beneath every mountain, every temple, every ancient ruin was evidence of Aryan godhood. He spoke of blood memory, the idea that ancestral knowledge lived in the genes, waiting to be unlocked. The goal wasn't just to discover the past, it was to become it. To resurrect the Aryan world order in steel, fire, and death. And so the Ahnenerbe produced documentaries, school curricula, even children's books, all reinforcing this fantasy. That Germany was not just a country, it was a resurrection. A reincarnation of a forgotten empire of light, order, and racial purity. But they needed more than bones and fairy tales. They needed language, symbols, magic. And in the crumbling inscriptions of the ancient Germanic world, they found something they could weaponize. Runes. Runic, magic, and wisdom. Before there were books, there were stones. Stark, jagged symbols carved into the face of the earth. Not words, not yet. Something older, more primal, runes. The alphabet of the ancient, etched in wood, stone, and bone, used not just to communicate, but to summon, to invoke, to shape fate itself. To the Nazis, runes weren't relics, they were keys, and Heinrich Himmler wanted to turn the entire SS into the lock they opened. The Nazis didn't invent rune obsession. That credit goes to 19th century German nationalists and romantic occultists, who saw the Old Norse runes as the lost language of a purer time, pre-Christian. Pan-Germanic spiritual system tied to the land, the blood, and the gods. But the Third Reich industrialized it. They took those mystical squiggles and turned them into state religion. At the center of this madness was Karl Maria Willigutta, mentally unstable mystic who claimed to be the last priest of an ancient Germanic cult. He believed runes weren't just letters, but vibrations, frequencies, carriers of spiritual power. He said he could remember things no one else could because his bloodline went back 200,000 years. Yes, 200,000. Williget claimed that ancient Aryans had once ruled the Earth with magical abilities granted by the runes. They could telepathically communicate, alter the weather, control the minds of lesser races. And then, they forgot. The knowledge was lost. The runes were scattered. But now, in the 20th century, they were being remembered. Guess who believed him? Himmler. Of course. Willigut was brought into the SS, given a rank, and tasked with reconstructing the true runic alphabet. He invented new symbols, assigned them mystical meanings, and declared them the spiritual core of the SS. The double lightning bolt insignia, Willigut runes, the Black Sunday mosaic at Wewelsburg. Built on his designs, he effectively created a new magical language for a death cult. And it didn't stop at design. SS officers were taught that runes could protect them, empower them, that carving the right symbols on your dagger or your skin could invoke the strength of ancient Aryan ancestors, that chanting certain rune combinations could summon energy, guidance, or even death upon your enemies. It was Hogwarts meets Auschwitz. They turned weddings into rune rituals, birth certificates were adorned with sacred glyphs, even death notices were stamped with runes representing the soul's journey to Valhalla or something darker. This was spellcraft at scale, occultism gone bureaucratic. And like everything else the Nazis touched, it was a desecration. Runes weren't always tools of fascism. In ancient times, they were used for divination, poetry, charm spells, and burial rites. They were symbols of life and mystery. The Nazis stripped them of context and stuffed them with hate, using ancient wisdom to justify modern brutality. But they weren't done. Not even close. Because runes were just the surface, letters. They wanted power. Real, supernatural, world-ending power. And they thought they knew where to find it. In a hidden force, a secret energy, an invisible current that could awaken machines, reshape minds, and resurrect empires. They called it Vril, the Vril force. Imagine a power source so ancient, so limitless, it could bend gravity, heal wounds, destroy armies, and unlock the latent potential buried inside the human soul. A cosmic Wi-Fi signal connecting all living things, not magic, not science, something in between, something other. This was Vril. To most, Vril began as fiction, a bizarre novel from 1871 called The Coming Race by Edward Bulwer Lytton. In it, an unnamed narrator stumbles into a subterranean world inhabited by the Vrilia, tall, telepathic beings who wield a mysterious energy called Vril. With it, they can fly, manipulate matter, kill with a thought. They don't fight wars, they cancel them. It was Victorian sci-fi. To the Nazis, it was a blueprint. They read The Coming Race like scripture. Ahnenerbe scholars debated its hidden truths. Occult societies like the Thule Society and the Vril Society treated it not as imagination, but revelation. In their view, Bulwer Lytton hadn't created the Vril myth, he'd received it. A glimpse into a lost prehistory when Aryan supermen ruled the earth with a power modern man had forgotten. And now, they wanted it back. They believed Vril was real. A cosmic force field, call it prana, chi, organ, it doesn't matter. What mattered was control. If they could tap into it, they wouldn't need tanks or planes. They'd have psychotronic weapons, Vril-powered flight, soldiers who could crush skulls with their minds. SS officers conducted seances. Mediums were recruited. Women with long hair and blank stares called. The Vrilarinnen claimed to channel messages from ancient Aryan star beings. These beings supposedly came from Aldebaran, a star in the Taurus constellation, and seeded Earth with their progeny thousands of years ago. Those progeny? The Aryans. It sounds like ancient aliens on meth. That's because it is. The Vril Society, if it ever existed officially, and that's still debated, operated in the darkest corners of Nazi mysticism. Allegedly, They believed in anti-gravity. They built prototypes of disc-shaped aircraft-tierly UFOs powered by spiraling Vril energy. Diagrams exist. Some witnesses claim to have seen them fly. Others call it myth, wartime propaganda, or post-war science fiction. But here's what's not debated. The Nazi regime poured real resources into anti-gravity research, secret labs, classified engineering projects. Code names like Haunebu and Die Glock, the Bell. Whether or not Vril powered these machines is irrelevant. What matters is that they believed it could. And belief, in Nazi Germany, was more dangerous than knowledge. In the catacombs of Welsburg, Vril rituals were allegedly conducted in chambers lined with the Black Sunday, not just meditation, activation. They believed they were awakening latent powers, tapping into a current that connected them with ancient Hyperborean ancestors, lost civilizations, even interdimensional beings. They weren't just trying to build superweapons. They were trying to ascend, to transcend human limitation, to become gods in uniform. And if that required turning physics into religion, so be it. If it meant treating science fiction as classified research, they didn't blink, because in their minds, Vril was the missing element. The thing that could make everything else Atlantis, Shambala, Aryan origins real. But the Reich collapsed before the Vril force could be unleashed. Or maybe it never existed. Maybe it was just another lie, wrapped in exotic jargon and occult iconography. Another fever dream, scrawled on the walls of a bunker as the world burned. Still, the legend didn't die. It morphed. After the war, whispers spread that the Nazis had made contact, that they'd escaped underground to Antarctica or to the stars, powered by Vril, waiting to return. But that's later. For now, the Nazis turned their eyes to something even older than myth. Not just a power source, a civilization, an entire world erased by a flood. Pre-flood civilizations. Pre-flood civilizations. Before the Bible, before Babylon, before even Sumeria, clawed its way into history with cuneiform, and kings there were whispers. Whispers of civilizations so old, so advanced, they became indistinguishable from gods, cities of light swallowed by water, towers that scraped the sky long before recorded time dared to start ticking. To the Nazis, this wasn't fantasy. It was foundation. They believed history had a blind spot of vast abyss where the truth of the Aryan origin lay buried, an epoch erased by a great deluge. Not just Noah's flood, but a worldwide cleansing, described in myths from every corner of the planet. The Hopi, the Hindus, the Greeks, the Mesopotamians. Different tongues, same story. A flood came, and with it, oblivion. Unless, of course, some survived. The Ahnenerbe framed the idea of pre-flood civilizations not as idle speculation, but as suppressed history. They believed that after the Great Cataclysm, whatever it was, comet, axis shift, ice-moon impact, thanks, Weltaislayer, the world's true rulers were forced underground or scattered across the globe. And those survivors? Aryans, Hyperborean remnant tribes, light bringers. In other words, Nazis from the Stone Age. They scoured ancient texts for hints. The Mahabharata's tales of celestial weapons and flying machines, clearly pre-flood Aryan technology, the Great Pyramid's geometric precision, obviously reverse-engineered from antediluvian blueprints, the megaliths at Göbekli Tepe, newly unearthed and 12,000 years old, must be Aryan astro temples. Never mind the complete lack of evidence, just look at those symmetrical columns. And once again, Atlantis took center stage. This time not as a one-off anomaly, but as a notion of many shining cities that dotted the pre-flood map. Some believed the antediluvian global culture stretched from Easter Island to Egypt to the Andes. Others went even further. Maybe the entire planet had once been a synchronized, rune-powered utopia. And then came the water. The Nazis didn't mourn this mythical loss. They mythologized it. The flood was a purge, a test. The unworthy drowned. The strong adapted. The survivors, those with pure blood and latent cosmic knowledge, became the ancestors of the Aryan race. They tried to map this forgotten world. Expeditions to South America followed Andean trails toward ancient cities buried under jungle and time. Teams in the Middle East dug beneath Sumerian ruins, looking for pre-Sumerian layers, what they called proto-civilizations. In the Alps, they examined glacial formations and cave paintings for signs of prehistoric Germanic intelligence. And every myth, they found giants, sky gods, great floods they folded into their narrative. They believed that what mainstream historians dismissed as metaphor or religious allegory was, in fact, encoded memory, and they alone had the key. Their ultimate claim? That the world before the flood was governed by a global Aryan theocracy, a brotherhood of wise, telepathic, spiritually elevated humans who wielded technologies now mistaken for miracles. The flood didn't destroy them. It concealed them. Until now, because the Nazis were going to bring it all back. Not just by finding it, by resurrecting it. That was the real goal, to leapfrog modernity, to go backward so hard they shot past the Bronze Age and landed in a glittering prehistoric super-civilization. One where the swastika wasn't a symbol of hate, but cosmic truth. One where the laws of physics bowed to the purity of blood and will. But they knew even that wouldn't be enough. Finding traces of lost worlds wasn't power. Power lay in what those civilizations left behind. Not stories. Not symbols. Technology. Lost ancient technologies. Lost ancient technologies. The Nazis were obsessed with one idea above all. What if the ancients were smarter than us? Not wiser, not more virtuous, smarter, technologically superior, capable of things we couldn't begin to explain with modern science. And if that was true, if long-lost civilizations had once wielded machines of impossible complexity, then maybe, just maybe, the Third Reich could find those blueprints, decode them, and build them. Welcome to the Nazi obsession with lost ancient technology. They weren't just looking for ruins. They were looking for prototypes, devices, engines, tools that defied explanation, stones that cut themselves, megaliths moved without cranes, batteries in Babylon, lasers in Luxor. The Ahnenerbe turned every ancient site into a workshop for impossible machines. And the logic was always the same. If the primitive people here couldn't have built this, then someone else must have. Guess who? The Aryans, of course. The Nazi pseudo-archaeologists believed these ancient super tools had been lost in the cataclysmic fall of Atlantis, or scattered after the Great Flood. They imagined survivors hauling gear up mountaintops, into jungle valleys, beneath desert shiding them from time, waiting for the worthy to rediscover them. Take the so-called Baghdad battery. A clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod. Dismissed by most archaeologists as a ceremonial object. But to the Nazis, a power cell. Proof that ancient civilizations understood electricity. Or the Antikythera Mechanisma Greek artifact found in a shipwreck. Essentially a gear-based analog computer. The Nazis never possessed it, but they studied reports obsessively. They saw it as evidence that the ancients weren't just building temples, they were building machines. Then there's the pyramids. Every lunatic theory you've ever heard? Nazis got there first. That the pyramids were energy conductors. That they were built using sound frequencies. That they aligned with Orion not by accident, but as part of a global communication grid. The Reich didn't just marvel at their symmetry, they tried to replicate it. Ahnenerbe scientists studied pyramid geometry, looking for vibrational harmonics. They speculated that If you placed certain materials at the right angle within a structure of perfect sacred proportion, you could amplify Vril energy. You could open psychic channels, heal the body. Power machines. And Yesem believed they tried to build one. There are rumors, never confirmed, of pyramid-shaped test structures in the forests outside Berlin. Wood and metal monoliths arranged according to ancient ratios. Part experiment, part temple, part antenna. It gets stranger. In the Andes, Edmund Kisies, him again claimed that Tiwanaku was a factory, that its walls weren't symbolic but functional, that the site had once been a power plant. He believed the stone carvings were schematics, flow charts, circuit boards etched into basalt. He wasn't alone. Some Nazi researchers believed Stonehenge was a radio tower, that obelisks were lightning rods for energy fields, that the swastika itself was a turbinia cosmic spinner pulling power from the ether. And then came the weapons. There are whispers, just whispers, of Nazi scientists trying to reverse engineer ancient war machines. Devices mentioned in myth, the Vajra of the Hindu gods, the flying Vimana chariots, the lightning spears of Zeus. They weren't metaphors, the Nazis insisted. They were prototypes. Tech disguised as magic? The Nazis believed they could recreate this. With enough stolen relics, enough looted manuscripts, enough blood sacrifices and screaming metal, they could bring it back. Build the ultimate weapon. One that didn't need uranium or rockets. One powered by Vril, channeled through rune glyphs, and aimed by pure will. It never worked. Nothing worked. But they kept digging, kept building, kept searching for that one buried engine, that one ancient gear that would turn the whole world upside down. Because if the ancients once had godlike power, it could happen again. But they needed a new science, a new cosmology, one not constrained by logic or evidence. Something colder, stranger. Welcome to the World Ice Theory. The World Ice Theory, Weltai's Lair. Science in Nazi Germany wasn't about discovery. It was about destiny. So when mainstream physics didn't support the racial and mythological fever dreams of the Third Reich, they didn't change their beliefs. They just changed the science. Enter Weltai's Lair World Ice Theory. It sounds like a rejected plotline from The Day After Tomorrow written during a blackout. The brainchild of Austrian engineer Hans Herbiger, this theory claimed that the entire cosmos was governed not by gravity, not by electromagnetism, but by ice, cosmic ice, space glaciers, frozen hydrogen as the fundamental building block of the universe. Stars? Giant balls of ice that eventually explode. Moons? Temporary chunks of cosmic snow spiraling toward Earth on a collision course. History. A cycle of lunar impacts that reset civilization over and over again. And the Nazis loved it. Why? Because it rejected everything Jewish physicists like Einstein stood for. It dismissed relativity, thermodynamics, and quantum mechanics all in favor of a new, racially pure cosmic vision. One that aligned perfectly with their mythology of floods, cataclysms, and ancient Aryan survivors. According to Weltai's Lair, the Earth had previously orbited multiple moons, each one causing a global disaster when it inevitably plunged from the sky. With each crash, civilizations were wiped out, continents reshaped, oceans raised. The last such impact, they claimed, destroyed Atlantis or Hyperoreia. The survivors? The Aryans, of course. It sounds insane because it is insane. But in Nazi Germany, it was taken seriously, officially. The SS backed it, schools taught it. Magazines published lavish illustrations of cosmic snowballs smashing into the earth like mythological snow grenades. Entire departments were funded to explore its implications. They believed Weltai's Lair explained everything. The sudden extinction of species? Ice moons. The flood myths of every ancient culture? Ice moons. The swastika? a symbol of swirling cosmic ice currents. And it wasn't just about the past. Some Nazi thinkers used world ice theory to predict the future. They believed a new moon might one day arrive, that another cataclysm was inevitable. But this time, they'd be ready. The Reich would endure. The Aryans would rebuild. It would be their Ragnarok and their rebirth. And of course, there was military application. If the ancients had harnessed cosmic ice power, why couldn't the Nazis? Some proposed weapons based on ice resonance. Others theorized that the properties of ice could be used in secret propulsion systems or to conduct spiritual energy. None of it worked, but it gave them a framework of frost-covered lens through which they could reinterpret every scrap of myth and ruin. They even claimed that ice shaped human evolution. According to some Nazi racial theorists, Aryans evolved in the north, in harsh, frozen environments that bred strength, purity, and resilience. In contrast, they argued, inferior races developed in warmer, softer climates. World ice theory gave this claim pseudo-scientific legitimacy, framing racial superiority as not just cultural but cosmic. And so, ice became sacred. It appeared in SS rituals, in art, in architecture. Wilsburg Castle's cold stone floors weren't just functional, they were symbolic. They mirrored the eternal frost of the universe, the unyielding hardness of the Aryan soul. In Nazi cosmology, to be cold was to be pure. Fire could be chaotic, but ice was order. But science has a funny way of fighting back. After the war, Weltai's lair was discarded, like a broken toy, discredited, forgotten. Even its surviving documents read like high-concept fiction written by a man trapped in a freezer with a thesaurus. Yet the dream persisted. Because the Nazis weren't really chasing ice. They were chasing control of nature, of history, of myth, and to get that control, they didn't just need power. They needed insight. So they turned, paradoxically, hypocritically, desperately eastward. To the land of karma, chakras, and forbidden knowledge. Esoteric Buddhism and Eastern mysticism. Esoteric Buddhism and Eastern mysticism. They hated everything that wasn't Aryan until it smelled like magic. The Nazi regime's racial ideology was built on purity, hierarchy, and exclusion. But when it came to power, real or imagined, all bets were off. And so, in one of history's most ironic ideological gymnastics routines, the Third Reich developed a fixation with the very traditions they publicly scorned. Welcome to the East. To be clear, they weren't interested in peace, enlightenment, or selflessness. They weren't meditating to transcend the ego. They were meditating to weaponize it. Esoteric Buddhism, tantric practices, Tibetan cosmology. These were not seen as religions or philosophies, but as technologies. Systems of inner control, psychic engineering, and the Ahnenerbe wanted the blueprints. Because while they preached Aryan supremacy, they quietly suspected the East might still hold the manual to the engine they were trying to restart. They studied the Tibetan concept of Tumoa meditative practice for generating body heat, supposedly allowing monks to survive sub-zero temperatures naked. Nazi scientists considered it a biological anomaly. Maybe even an evolutionary trait that could be replicated in soldiers. They read the Kala Chakra Tantra, which describes cyclical time, cosmic machinery, and a prophesied battle between the forces of darkness and a messianic king from Shambala. To the Reich, it wasn't prophesied, was a script, a parallel myth to their own. They saw themselves as that hidden force, the secret army, the last great resistance against the chaos of the modern world. And then there was Bardoth Tibetan state between death and rebirth. Some Nazi occultists interpreted this as a gateway, a transitional zone between realms. And if the soul could pass through, why not something else? They turned monks into specimens, sacred texts into field manuals, rituals into test cases. During the 1938-39 SS expedition to Tibet, Ernst Schaefer's team wasn't just measuring skulls. They were infiltrating monasteries, photographing mandalas, looting scrolls, asking questions no one should ask with the intensity of people expecting an answer. They were trying to crack the code. One Nazi document describes a theory that Montreux ancient chants could alter consciousness in measurable, repeatable ways. That the right frequency, intoned correctly, might enhance memory, perception, even aggression. There were reports deep in Ahnenerbe archives of sound-based experiments on prisoners, attempting to induce trances or madness with vibration and tone. This was mysticism meets madness, a theology of force. And yet, behind all this was a deeper hypocrisy. Because Tibetan Buddhism, with its ideas of compassion, reincarnation, and detachment from ego, was fundamentally incompatible with fascism. But the Nazis weren't reading it for meaning. They were stripping it for parts. In their worldview, wisdom was power only if it could be bent to serve the state. So they extracted what they wanted: ritual structures, breathing techniques, visualizations, and tossed the rest. And when that didn't work fast enough, they turned to darker paths, Tibetan death rites, tantric wrathful deities, the dakinis and dharma palace beings of fierce wisdom, often mistaken for demons. The Nazis loved the idea of enlightened violence, spiritual warfare. A soldier who kills, not from hate, but from cosmic necessity. Of course, it was all projection. They weren't finding truth in the East. They were finding reflections of their own madness. And yet the symbols stuck. Swastikas, lifted from Hindu and Buddhist temples, were rotated and corrupted into the emblem of genocide. Mandalas appeared in SS documents as models of psychological warfare. The East had become a mirror room they stared into, until their own eyes stared back, just more ancient. But even all this mysticism wasn't enough. They wanted something closer to home, something physical, a land, a stone, a shrine they could dig up, not just imagine. And in the twisted woods of Germany, they found just that. Ancient Germanic cult sites. Ancient Germanic cult sites. Deep in the German countryside, where the fog rolls in like memory, and the trees lean like ancient sentinels, the Nazis dug. Not for gold, not for oil. They dug for roots. The Reich's obsession with ancestry wasn't just metaphorical. They believed the very soil of Germany's hills, caves, and crags held the buried skeleton of a forgotten golden age. A prehistoric time when the Germanic tribes weren't just barbarians. They were priests, shamans, keepers of an ancient, blood-bound wisdom. To rediscover that past was to reclaim their future. And no place burned brighter in this fever dream than the Externstein. Jutting out of the Teutoburg forest like the fossilized bones of titans, the Externstein is a jagged rock formation, long shrouded in mystery and folklore. Pagan ceremonies, solar alignments, hidden carvings. For most historians, it's a natural site with layers of local legend. For the Nazis, it was the lost heart of the Germanic soul. The Ahnenerbe designated the Externstein as a sacred site. SS archaeologists swarmed the area in the 1930s, conducting excavations, surveys, and ritual reconstructions. They claimed it was an ancient Germanic temple older than Stonehenge, a place of solstice observance, rune casting, and ancestor worship. Himmler himself made pilgrimages there. He saw it as a Nordic Jerusalem, a spiritual axis for the SS's new religion. Plans were drawn to turn the area into a ritual complex, complete with processional paths, ceremonial platforms, and monuments to Aryan ancestors. Concrete nationalism with a pagan finish. They weren't just mythologizing the landscape, they were colonizing it. Other cult sites followed. Heidenheim, Sachsenhain, the Thingstetten amphitheaters, locations chosen for their vague historical resonance and rebranded as holy sites of the Volk. ritual spaces where ancient Germans once gathered, now resurrected as Nazi theater. Blood and soil pageants, torchlit oaths, songs sung to oak trees and forgotten gods. They revived the old festivals too. Julance, winter solstice celebration, was stripped of its Christian overlay and reborn as a nationalist ritual. SS families decorated Yule trees with sun wheels and swastikas. Children were taught to honor Die Onenthe, ancestors whose spirits were said to return each year to test the racial worth of the living. And behind every ritual, every chant, was the unspoken goal to replace Christianity. Not with atheism, with something older, something Aryan. Himmler envisioned a new faith for the SSA, religion of discipline, ancestry, and racial mysticism. Wurzburg Castle was its temple, the Externstein, its shrine. The cult sites were to be pilgrimage grounds for generations of indoctrinated youth, raised not on gospel, but on genetics and granite. And it worked for a while. The landscape itself became propaganda, a living myth. And the rituals gave the illusion of belonging, purpose, eternity, a connection not to a god, but to blood. But even as they worshipped the land, they feared its silence. Because nature doesn't choose sides. The forest doesn't care what flag you wave. The stones don't remember who carves the runes. And so they dug deeper, past cult, past culture, into the marrow of myth. They needed the ancestors to speak. Not symbolically, literally. The power of ancestors. The power of ancestors. In the heart of the SS, mythos was a belief so primal, so irrational, that it made even their more scientific delusions seem quaint. It was the idea that blood remembers. That heritage isn't just identity, it's energy. A battery of the dead, still pulsing under the skin. To the Nazis, ancestry wasn't a record, it was a resource. They believed that within the DNA of the pure-blooded Aryan lay the unbroken memory of an ancient race of demigods, warriors who didn't just fight with weapons but with will, priests who could summon storms, kings who ruled not by birthright alone but by spiritual voltage, and that even in death, these ancestors could offer power. You just had to know how to ask. Himmler took this to ritualistic extremes. The SS wasn't just an army, it was a blood order. Admission required detailed genealogical proof of Aryan lineage stretching back to 1750 or earlier. Not just for record-keeping, but to confirm spiritual eligibility, because if you couldn't trace your blood to the mythical past, how could you be expected to carry its future? But that was just the start. The Ahnenerbe funded research into what they called Blutbewusstsein, blood consciousness. The theory went like this. Your ancestors' experiences, fears, triumphs, secrets were encoded in your genetic material. By activating this consciousness, a person could remember past lives. Not in the metaphysical, Eastern sense, but as racial recall, heritage as hard drive. SS officers participated in strange meditative rites. In underground chambers lit by torchlight and echoing with chant, they would attempt to summon ancestral visions, to relive ancient battles, to feel the thrill of conquest from centuries past. It wasn't nostalgia, it was training. And when meditation failed, they turned to the dead directly. In some of the darker corners of Nazi archaeology, there were exhumations not just for study, but for ritual. Skulls of supposed Germanic chieftains were kept in ceremonial halls. Bones were placed in altars. Ceremonies were held at ancient burial mounds, where SS officers would swear loyalty to ancestors they believed were watching from beyond the veil. This wasn't just spiritualism. It was ancestor worship reskinned for fascism. Himmler, always chasing his own inner mythology, even commissioned the construction of an ancestral vault beneath Wurzburg Castle. The plan was to inter the bones of SS officers who died in service, creating a necro-temple of elite Aryan spirits, a psychic reservoir, a ghost army, waiting to be awakened in Germany's darkest hour. And they didn't stop there. They believed that family bloodlines could carry curses, that racial impurities weren't just social problems, but spiritual infections. And so, just as they glorified certain lineages, they hunted others, exterminating entire families to cleanse the blood of the Volk. It was eugenics mixed with exorcism, genocide as ritual purification. The Nazis weren't just trying to shape the future, they were trying to resurrect the past, not through books or ruins, but through bodies, through blood. They believed they could become vessels for their ancestors, that the right ritual, the right symbol, the right moment could make them channels for forgotten power. It wasn't enough to be Aryan. You had to embody Aryan history, live it, breathe it, bleed it. But who were these ancestors? The answer was in the stories, the myths, the thunder and fury of gods who weren't above man but part of him. Gods who fought, who feasted, who fell. Which brings us to the next stop in the Nazi myth-industrial complex. Norse mythology and sagas. Norse mythology and sagas. Odin, Thor, Freya, Valhalla. To most of the world, these are legend echoes of a wild, poetic past, told in frostbitten verse and carried down through centuries of oral tradition and later Christian revision. But to the Nazis, they were more than stories. They were scripture, a roadmap to a civilization before Christianity, before Rome, before contamination. A blueprint for a pure world. Norse mythology offered exactly what the Nazi mythmakers craved. Epic battles, bloodlines of gods, a final apocalyptic war where the world is reborn through fire and death. It was violent, hierarchical, stoic, a warlike spirituality bound by honor and fate, perfect. And they twisted it into a political theology. The SS turned to the Edda Icelandic sagas that contained fragments of Norse cosmology, warrior codes, and creation myths. But they didn't just study them, they rewrote them. Translations were edited. Interpretations were warped. Gods were recast as ancient Aryan leaders. Myth became history, and history became propaganda. Odin wasn't just the All-Father. He was the original Führer, a war shaman, a master of sacrifice and wisdom who gave an eye for knowledge and hung himself from a tree for 9 days to understand the runes. The Nazis loved that, the self-martyrdom, the stoicism, the brutal quest for power through suffering. And Thor? He wasn't a comic book hero back then. He was the SS's ideal soldier, strong, loyal, hammer-wielding destroyer of chaos, protector of the race. The 9 worlds of Norse cosmology, Midgard, Asgard, Jotunheim, and the rest were interpreted as symbolic representations of racial purity, spiritual evolution, and the cosmic battle between order and degeneracy. Even Yggdrasil, the world tree, was reframed as a racial family tree, each root and branch representing a line of Aryan descent, stretching back to the dawn of time. The Nazis didn't just admire the sagas, they reenacted them. Ceremonies in Wurzburg invoked the names of Norse gods. SS units were named after mythical heroes and runes. Rituals were designed around solstices, lunar phases, and the seasonal calendar of the old Germanic tribes. The wild hunt of Odin became a metaphor for SS death squads pursuing racial enemies. It wasn't metaphor to them. It was destiny. And of course, they loathed Christianity's role in suppressing the old faith. To the Nazis, the Christianization of Scandinavia and Germany was a disaster, a betrayal of the ancient race. The burning of the old temples, the erasure of the gods, the forced conversion of a warrior culture into one of guilt and meekness. They wanted to undo it. Himmler, in particular, viewed the Christian cross as a foreign infection. He dreamed of a new religion, blood faith rooted in the sagas, governed by ancestral spirits and the divine hierarchy of the Norse pantheon, one where death in battle was not just glorious, it was sacramental, where fate wasn't just accepted, it was embraced, like a spear to the chest. This is where Ragnarok comes in. The end of the world, the gods die, the monsters win, and then the rebirth. To the Nazi mythmakers, this was more than prophecy. It was inevitability. They believed they were in the Ragnarok moment, facing a world of chaos, decadence, and moral collapse. Their solution? Burn it down, and from the ashes, build a new world, a purer one. The sagas became fuel. And yet, even as they tried to stitch together their myth-based empire, they couldn't ignore the inconvenient truth. Norse mythology was not exclusive. It wasn't nationalist. It was communal, fluid, open to outsiders. It didn't match the strict racial hierarchies they needed. So they changed it, rewrote Odin's lineage, scrubbed the multi-ethnic realities of Viking trade and raiding, airbrushed history into ideology. They didn't want the truth. They wanted validation. And if the sagas couldn't provide it, they'd look elsewhere, higher up, stranger. To the roof of the world, where monks whisper to mountains and cities hide behind snow. It was time to go back to Tibet. The 1939 Tibet expeditions. Tibet expeditions. The year was 1938. While Europe teetered on the brink of chaos, 5 men in Nazi uniforms boarded a ship bound for India. Their final destination? The roof of the world, Tibet. This wasn't a sightseeing trip. This was a sanctioned expedition, authorized by Heinrich Himmler himself, under the auspices of the Ahnenerbe. Officially, it was a scientific mission. Zoology, ethnography, botany. The kind of expedition you'd find in the dusty corner of a museum catalog. Unofficially, they were hunting the origins of the Aryan race, again. But this time, they believed they might actually find it. The expedition was led by Ernst Schaefer, a German zoologist with a taste for adventure and for currying favor with the SS. He'd already explored parts of Asia before. Himmler saw in him a perfect instrument, disciplined, intelligent, and just deluded enough to carry the Reich racial gospel to the Himalayas. The real mission? To prove that Tibet was once home to an ancient Aryan colony, that the high lamas and noble bloodlines of the region were descendants of Hyperborean survivors, that the mysticism of Tibetan Buddhism held encoded memories of an Aryan golden age. And if that sounds like a geopolitical acid trip, well, it was. The team traveled through British India, navigated the political minefield of entering Tibet, and finally set up camp in Lhasa. From there, they began their bizarre work. They took skull measurements of locals, photographed monks like insects, collected religious artifacts, maps, even children's toys. Schaefer's men turned sacred rituals into laboratory samples, interpreting mandalas as star charts and prayer flags as Proto-Germanic runes. They even tried to find the entrance to Shambala again. Some reports claim the team interrogated monks about hidden cities. Others suggest that Nazi occultists back in Germany were using telepathic rituals to guide the expedition remotely. Whether they truly believed they could unlock a spiritual gateway or just wanted something exotic for Himmler's trophy case is still debated. The expedition sent crates of material back to Berlin. Sacred texts, bones, botanical samples, even live animals. Himmler reportedly reviewed every shipment personally, searching for signs of ancient wisdom, especially anything that might link Tibetan legends to the Aryan migration myths. The Reich was so desperate to fabricate. But what did they really find? Nothing. At least, not in the way they hoped. No mystical Aryan relics. No ancient inscriptions identifying the Buddha as a Germanic astronaut. No hidden staircases to Shambhala. Still, the expedition was declared a success. In the warped logic of Nazi esotericism, not finding something only meant they needed to dig deeper. Tibet became another cornerstone in their imaginary map of a prehistoric Aryan empire. They published photographs, held exhibitions, and built a racial narrative out of misinterpretations and deliberate fantasy. And the damage? The intrusion rattled Tibetan society, strained international relations, and opened the door to further exploitation. The Nazis didn't just loot artifacts, they extracted meaning. They took living culture and pinned it to their ideology, like butterflies in a display case. After the war, the legacy of the expedition faded into obscurity until conspiracy theorists revived it, layering it with tales of secret Nazi bases, hollow Earth gateways, and extraterrestrial contact. Some claimed Schaefer discovered advanced Tibetan technology. Others swore that Nazis remained behind in hidden monasteries. All fiction. But like most Nazi myths, it wasn't about truth. It was about belief. They didn't need evidence, they needed mythological permission. And if the highlands of Tibet didn't deliver, maybe the thin air of the Andes would. Because in the ruins of Tiwanaku, the Nazis thought they saw something incredible. Proof that ancient Andean temples weren't built by indigenous hands, but by exiled Aryan gods. Andean temples and ancient migrations. Andean temples and ancient migrations. High in the Bolivian highlands, where the air is razor-thin and the mountains pierce the sky like jagged teeth, lies Tiwanaku, a ruined city of monolithic stones, cosmic alignments, and secrets that predate the Incas by centuries. To most archaeologists, it's a marvel of ancient indigenous engineering. To the Nazis, it was an outpost, a colony of the original Aryans, carved into the bones of the Andes by survivors of a cataclysm that shattered their home and scattered their bloodline across the globe. At the center of this theory stood Edmund Kisa, German architect, amateur archaeologist, and full-time fantasist who believed Tiwanaku wasn't just old, it was prehistoric, built long before any known civilization by a race of Nordic migrants fleeing the end of Atlantis or Hyperoreia. He claimed the architecture had Aryan fingerprints, right angles, astronomical precision, symbolism that resembled European runes. To him, Tiwanaku wasn't just a city, it was a time capsule, a frozen memory of a lost global order, rooted in racial superiority and cosmic destiny. And he wasn't alone. The Ananarabe funded Kis's theories, giving him the resources to publish, travel, and speak with the air of academic legitimacy. He argued that South America had been colonized by ancient Europeans, who brought with them science, culture, and order. Everything that came after Inca, Maya, Aztec was, in his view, a degeneration. The indigenous people were not creators, they were caretakers, custodians of a forgotten Aryan inheritance. Let that sink in. The Nazis claimed ancient brown civilizations could only exist because long-lost white people built them first. This wasn't just racism, it was historical vandalism. Kiss asserted that Tiwanaku's massive stone sum weighing over 100 tons couldn't have been moved by primitive technology. He theorized levitation, sound-based tools, and magnetic field manipulation, all of which, he claimed, pointed to advanced knowledge carried by prehistoric migrants from a northern homeland. In other words, lost Aryan tech. The idea of ancient migrations wasn't limited to the Andes. Nazi theorists mapped a global diaspora of super-Aryans, sailing across oceans, marching over ice bridges, seeding every major civilization. Egypt, Aryans. Persia, Aryans. Easter Island, somehow, also Aryans. The Nazis painted themselves not as conquerors, but returners, cosmic heirs reclaiming what was always theirs. Tiwanaku, with its strange symbols and celestial alignments, became a linchpin. Kiss believed it had been built to track solstices, equinoxes, and perhaps even cataclysmic cycles like those in world ice theory. He suggested the site had encoded knowledge of planetary catastrophes, warning of the next great flood or polar shift. He published books, held lectures, SS officers quoted his theories. Himmler himself reportedly read Kiss's works with interest. But here's the kicker. Kiss never actually excavated Tiwanaku. His theories were based largely on photographs, second-hand accounts, and architectural guesswork. He took the ruins and reverse-engineered them into ideology. That didn't matter. To the Nazis, plausibility was optional. What mattered was resonance, the feeling that a place fit into their myth, that it could be used. And in Tiwanaku, they found a symbol of continuity, a checkpoint in the mythical migration of the master race. A haunted city whispering the same promise they heard in Tibet, in the Norse sagas, in every ruined stone they could warp into prophecy. You were here first, and you will return. The irony, of course, is that the indigenous cultures the Nazis dismissed had built Tiwanaku with astonishing skill-using tools, methods, and cosmologies that still elude full explanation. They didn't need Nordic ancestors. They had genius. But that wasn't the story the Reich wanted. Because if brown people could build wonders, the myth broke. And so they kept digging. Not just in the ground, but in the past, in manuscripts, in myth. Next on the list? A tapestry. A battlefield in thread. One they thought might contain secret proof of their eternal right to rule. The Bayeux Tapestry. The Bayeux Tapestry. It's nearly 70 meters of linen, hand-stitched, faded with age, a medieval comic strip narrating the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Knights, ships, horses, and a shooting star. To the average historian, the Bayeux Tapestry is a masterwork of embroidery and propagandan account of power shifting from Saxon to Norman hands. To the Nazis, it was evidence. Buried in its needlework, they believed, was a message, a blood-coated chronicle of ancient Aryan might. And like every ancient object the Reich touched, they transformed the tapestry into something it was never meant to be, a racial artifact, a genetic scroll. The Nazis viewed the tapestry as a symbolic confirmation of Germanic supremacy. Their twisted logic went like this. The Normans were of Viking stock. The Saxons were Germanic. The conquest of England wasn't just a military victory, was a tribal family reunion. Aryans fighting Aryans for dominance. And in either case, they won. In Nazi terms, the tapestry didn't show the rise of England. It showed the ascendancy of the Aryan warrior class, a kind of mythic rerun of Hyperborean inheritance, embroidered in thread. Ahnenerbe scholars analyzed the tapestry with absurd intensity. They counted how many times a particular symbol appeared. They tracked the body shapes, armor designs, even facial angles, arguing that these demonstrated racial characteristics of the combatants. They believed that certain figures, especially the leaders, were idealized versions of Aryan manhood. Harold? A tragic, noble figure with Germanic roots. William? The destined conqueror, embodying racial will. It didn't matter that none of this was historically sound. The tapestry became a Nazi mirror. Every stitch was interpreted as proof of bloodlines and destiny. They even theorized that the comet depicted at the top of the tapestry, Halley's Comet, was a cosmic signal of Aryan return, that it wasn't just an omen, but a prophecy of future conquest. And that future, they believed, was the Third Reich. They used the tapestry as a visual justification for the occupation of France. We've been here before, they said. We ruled this land through the Normans. We are not invaders. We are restorers. It was historical gaslighting at an embroidered level. In 1940, when Nazi forces rolled into Paris, they seized thousands of cultural treasures. But the Bayeux Tapestry held special status. Hitler ordered it to be preserved and possibly transported to Berlin. It was earmarked for inclusion in his planned Führer Museum, a grotesque cultural Frankenstein's monster that would showcase stolen art as Nazi heritage. It never made it out of France. The tapestry was hidden by the French resistance, shuffled between safe locations, and eventually protected by Allied forces. But the fact remains, one of the Reich's most prized cultural targets was a medieval tapestry that they believed confirmed their ancient racial supremacy. It's laughable if it wasn't so terrifying, because it shows the extent of their delusion, their willingness to rewrite any religion, science, needlepoint toe, support their vision of the past. But they didn't just want stories of conquest. They wanted symbols, ancient ones, carved into stone, etched into caves, left behind like breadcrumbs by ancestors who had supposedly touched the divine. And so they went hunting for runestones and prehistoric art across the cold, silent expanses of the north, where they believed the truth of Aryan origins lay scrawled in the language of the gods. Runestones and Proto-Germanic art. Runestones and Proto-Germanic art. In the windswept stillness of the Scandinavian countryside, large slabs of stone rise from the earth like forgotten monoliths. Inscribed on them are tangled loops of ancient script runes, etched by hands long vanished. To most, they're archaeological treasures. To the Nazis, they were something else entirely. They were messages from the past, for the chosen, whispered across millennia in stone and symbol. The Ahnenerbe saw runestones not as relics but as receivers antennae for ancestral energy, cosmic memory, and forgotten power. They believed these carved texts held the spiritual DNA of the Aryan race. If they could decode the language, they wouldn't just uncover history, they could unlock destiny. And they looked everywhere. Expeditions swept across Germany, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and Denmark hunting for runestones, burial mounds, petroglyphs. Anywhere an ancient hand had scratched meaning into rock, the Nazis sent scholars and SS officers with measuring tapes, calipers, and cameras. Their favorite finds? The massive runestones of Sweden. Stones like the Rook runestone covered in dense, cryptic inscriptions referencing forgotten gods, ancestral glory, and a world before memory. To the Nazis, this wasn't poetry, it was prophecy. They pored over translations, assigning meanings that bent toward their ideology, purity, bloodline, conquest. Then there was the island of Rügen in the Baltic Sea. Rich with local legend and ringed with cliffs and stone circles, it became a Nazi pilgrimage site. They claimed it was once a holy place for the Germanic tribes, where rune magic had been practiced under the stars, guided by the rhythms of the earth. A kind of prehistoric Hogwarts minus the charm. The Ahnenerbe theorized that these stones weren't just records, they were tools. That ancient Germans had used them to cast spells, channel energy, or even encode sacred geometry that resonated with planetary alignments. Some believed that the layout of runestones across landscapes wasn't random, it was a map, a psychic circuit, a prehistoric power grid. So they mapped everything. Drew lines between sites, calculated angles, ran esoteric math equations looking for ley lines and harmonic frequencies. If the ancients had once created a network of stone-cast magic, the Nazis intended to reboot it. But they didn't stop at stones. They became obsessed with Proto-Germanic artanimal motifs, spiral patterns, weapon engravings, bone carvings. The weirder and older, the better. Any symbol that seemed to suggest a pre-Christian, pre-civilized, hyper-pure Germanic culture was snatched, catalogued, and stuffed into Nazi museums or private SS collections. They drew direct lines from these ancient motifs to the aesthetics of the Reich. The jagged, angular lines of runes were incorporated into SS insignia, banners, even architecture. The stylized eagles and wolves of ancient art reappeared as emblems of the modern Nazi machine. They didn't just want to study the past, they wanted to resurrect it, to live inside its symbols, to wear its magic like armor. But there was a problem. Most of this art was ambiguous, multicultural, fluid. The same symbol could appear in Celtic, Slavic, and Nordic contexts. It wasn't racially pure. It was human. But the Nazis didn't care. They carved out what they wanted and discarded the rest. They didn't want to understand history. They wanted to own it. And they built shrines for it, like the SS-run museum in Salzburg, where artifacts were displayed not as educational tools, but as relics of an unbroken lineage from Stone Age shamans to stormtroopers. It was a cathedral of delusion, a place where ancient art became ideology, where every spiral was a solar code, every glyph a sacred instruction, every animal figure a god they could claim as their own. But symbols are only as powerful as the faith behind them. And for the Nazis, that faith demanded an altar. A central symbol that fused race, mysticism, and domination into one all-seeing eye. They found it in a shape most people would never even notice. 12 twisted rays, spiraling inward. The Black Sunday. The Black Sunday. 12 dark rays coiling inward like a frozen vortex, a wheel of death, a clock with no hands, a symbol so cryptic it might be dismissed as mere design until you realize it was embedded in the heart of the SS. The Black Sunday. Found inlaid in the marble floor of Welsburg Castle's North Tower, Himmler's occult sanctum, the Black Sunday wasn't just decor. It was a seal, a sigil, the eye of the storm at the center of Nazi mysticism. To the uninitiated, it looks like a stylized sun wheel, but to the SS, it was something far older and far more dangerous, a symbol of hidden knowledge, esoteric power. Dark, light, the kind that doesn't illuminate, but devours. And no one knows exactly where it came from. The design doesn't appear in ancient runic texts. It's not carved into Viking longships or etched in Bronze Age caves. Some believe it was inspired by old Germanic sun wheels. Others suggest it was fabricated entirely by SS occultists, particularly Karl Maria Willigut, Himmler's favorite Looney Tunes mystic who claimed to remember lost Aryan histories stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Willigut insisted the Black Sunday represented an invisible energy source, a kind of spiritual gravitational pull emanating from beyond the stars, from which the ancient Aryans once drew strength. He said it powered their cities, fed their minds, even elevated their souls. It was Vril, blood memory, ancestral might all compacted into a single symbol. And the Nazis bought it wholesale. Welsburg Castle became the temple of this darkness. The North Tower, called the Obergruppenführersaal, was built with the Black Sunday at its center, surrounded by 12 columns like some apocalyptic Stonehenge. 12 chairs for 12 SS generals, 12 seats for the priest kings of the New World Order. They called it the SS Camelot. It wasn't just ritual, it was rehearsal. The Black Sunday floor wasn't meant to be admired. It was meant to be stood upon, to channel energy, to conduct ceremonies that would bind the elite to the myth. Officers were brought here to swear oaths, to meditate, to tune in to the frequency of ancestral power. And behind it all was Himmler, the maestro of madness. He believed the Black Sunday was the spiritual heart of the Reich, a new swastika, sacred, and more potent. Where the swastika spun outward in light, the Black Sunday pulled inward into darkness. It represented death, rebirth, and the eternal cycle of blood and soil. The two weren't in conflict. They were a dual system. Swastika for the masses, Black Sunday for the inner circle. But as the war turned against Germany, the symbol took on a more sinister role. It became a symbol of last resort, the hidden path, the final spell. The belief that even in collapse, even in the ashes of defeat, something would survive, something beneath the surface. And so, conspiracy theories were born. Some believe the Black Sunday is still active, carved into the earth at secret Nazi bases in Antarctica. Others think it's a beacon, a psychic transmitter calling out to long-dead Aryan gods or future ones. And still others insist that those 12 rays represent not just energy, but people, a council, a cult. Today, the symbol persists in neo-Nazi tattoos, in occult literature, in the darkest corners of esoteric fascism. It has outlived its creators, taking on a life of its own, like a sigil that refuses to die. But in the 1940s, it was simply the deepest layer of the Nazi myth machine. The final symbol in their tarot deck of delusion, the secret sun that casts no light, only shadow. And if that shadow had shape, if it had space to hide, it wouldn't be in Berlin, or Nuremberg, or any known city. It would be inside, within the earth, waiting. The hollow earth theory. The hollow earth theory. Let's take a breath. And now, let's dive straight into the earth. Not metaphorically, literally. Because deep in the rabbit hole of Nazi occult, obsession somewhere between the Atlantean death cults, rune-based telepathy, and cosmic frost cosmologies lies one of their most absurd yet persistent beliefs, the hollow earth theory. And yes, they were serious. The basic premise: the earth is not solid. Beneath the crust is a vast, habitable inner world, a second planet inside our planet, complete with its own sun, vegetation, advanced being sand, if you ask the Nazis, the last surviving Aryan super race. They didn't invent this idea. The hollow earth theory goes back centuries. Halley, Euler, and even some fringe 19th century explorers toyed with it. But where they saw science fiction, the Nazis saw salvation. Here's how they twisted it. According to certain Nazi esotericists, the Aryans weren't just from the north, they were from inside. The original master race had fled beneath the Earth's surface after a prehistoric cataclysm, flood, ice moon, take your pick, establishing a secret inner civilization, untouched by the corruption of the outer world. And they didn't just survive, they thrived. Rumors spoke of giant cities under the poles, subterranean forests, ancient temples powered by Vril energy. Some said the entrances were at the north and south poles, circular, magnetic gateways that ships could pass through if they knew the path. Which is where the Nazis come in. They allegedly launched expeditions to the poles not just for territorial claims, but to find the way in. There are scattered reports, buried in layers of conspiracy and half-truth, that in 1938, German submarines surveyed the Antarctic coast for signs of subterranean passageways. That maps were made. That tunnels were found. Did they go in? No proof. But they sure planned for it. Himmler greenlit research into what was dubbed the whole welt theory, a warped sub-branch of the hollow earth theory which inverted the model entirely. In this version, we live inside the earth, and the sky is a vast illusion created by the curvature of the inner shell. Stars, projections, Sunday, a central orb suspended at the core. It sounds laughable, until you realize they funded this. They built globes, ran calculations, drafted diagrams. SS scientists in black uniforms stood around chalkboards trying to model artillery trajectories that curved inward. Because if the world was hollow, then the Reich's rockets didn't just aim up, they could aim through. It was complete pseudoscientific lunacy. But to the SS, it wasn't about accuracy, it was about belief. Because the hollow earth represented more than a theory. It was a symbol of escape. As the war began to crumble, when Berlin shook and the Allies closed in, the idea of a hidden refuge beneath the world grew more seductive. Conspiracy legends still whisper of U-boats vanishing into the southern ice, of secret bases under Antarctica, of Nazi leaders fleeing not to Argentina, but to Agartha, the capital of the inner world, where they would wait, and rebuild, and return. Some even claim that Hitler didn't die in the bunker, but was spirited away to the hollow earth, alive, immortal, guarded by Aryan gods and crystal technology, biding his time until the outer world was ripe for reclamation. Of course, there's no evidence. There never was. But that never mattered to the Nazis. The hollow earth theory wasn't just escapism, it was an insurance policy, a mythic plan B. A final refuge for a regime built on death, delusion, and the belief that history could be rewritten from the inside out. But even in this fantasy, the clock was ticking, because death and the fear of it haunted them all. They didn't just want escape, they wanted forever. Which brings us to their next obsession, the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone. Immortality. Transmutation. Godhood in a flask. The Philosopher's Stone was the ultimate prison not just of alchemists, but of empire builders, warlords, and madmen who believed death was optional. In medieval texts, it was a mythical substance capable of turning base metals into gold, curing any disease, and granting eternal life. A holy grail of chemistry and mysticism, buried in riddles and fire. To the Nazis, it was serious business. They weren't just chasing victory, they were chasing permanence. The Third Reich wasn't meant to last a decade, it was meant to last 1,000 years, and for that, they needed more than tanks and propaganda. They needed to conquer time itself. So they turned to alchemy. Not the metaphorical kind, the real, messy, sulfur-stinking, mercury-maddening craft of ancient experimenters who thought they could bottle the divine. Himmler, as usual, led the charge. He was obsessed with the notion that alchemical knowledge was suppressed, not false, just hidden, lost in the ashes of burned libraries, stolen by monks, encrypted in symbology. And somewhere, someone still had it. Ahnenerbe scholars ransacked medieval manuscripts, grimoires, and rare Latin scrolls. They traced the footprints of Paracelsus, Nicholas Flamel, and Roger Bacon. They studied Renaissance diagrams of alchemical ovens, moons, dragons, and sun-kissed kings. Not as art, as blueprints. Some believed the Philosopher's Stone wasn't a stone at all, but a process, a sacred rite of purification, involving fire, suffering, and transformation. The stone was the self-perfected. And this fit nicely with Nazi ideology, the Übermensch forged in flame. Others thought it was literal, that there existed a physical object, perhaps crystalline, perhaps liquid, that granted endless life. Nazi agents searched monasteries, interviewed occultists, offered deals to secret societies. If someone had the stone, the Reich would pay any price, or take it by force. And the rumors multiplied. That the stone had been hidden in southern France, near Cathar ruins, a favorite Nazi hunting ground. That it was buried beneath the Vatican. That it was guarded by a bloodline of Rosicrucians who moved it every few years to keep it out of tyrannical hands. There are even fringe accounts buried deep in post-war conspiracy culture that Nazi scientists attempted to manufacture a version of the stone using electrochemical processes. Mixing mercury, gold, and organic matter in hermetically sealed vessels, they conducted experiments that were part chemistry, part ritual, always in secret, always in fear. Because time was the enemy. As the war dragged on and Hitler's health declined, whispers of immortality grew louder. Himmler, ever the esoteric hoarder, dreamed of a post-war world ruled by an immortal SS. Guardians of blood, time, and truth. A priesthood with no death. But the stone never came. Gold wasn't made, death wasn't cheated, and the 1,000-year Reich crumbled in 12. Still, the dream of the stone lingered. It fed into other Nazi pursuits, the search for ancient DNA, the obsession with bloodlines, the idea of a spiritually and biologically perfected human being. The stone was a metaphor for everything they wanted, a way to turn the impure into the divine, the broken into the unbreakable. and even in failure they kept going. Because if the Philosopher's Stone was real, it meant the past had already conquered death, that someone, somewhere, had found the key. And if they couldn't find it whole, maybe they could at least collect its scattered parts. Which leads us to the broader, more ravenous pursuit that grew like a shadow beneath the Reich's obsession with the stone. Not just alchemy, but alchemy and its secrets. Alchemy and its secrets. Forget the modern lab coat. Picture instead a stone cell lit by candlelight, reeking of sulfur and scorched copper. A hooded figure hunched over flasks, muttering Latin as metal groans in its transition. This was alchemith, spiritual cousin of science, the mystical mother of chemistry, and for the Nazis, an instruction manual for dominion over matter and soul. If the Philosopher's Stone was the jewel of the quest, alchemy was the language to reach it. And the Nazis spoke it fluently. Heinrich Himmler's SS was saturated in alchemical symbolism. Black Sunday, rune circles. The double lightning bolts weren't just a logo, they were a sigil. Everything in the Nazi aesthetic echoed alchemical themes: transmutation, purification, sacrifice, resurrection. A society forged not just in fire, but in transformation. But they didn't just admire the symbols, they chased the science. Alchemical texts locked away in monasteries and museums were stolen, copied, and analyzed. Manuscripts from the Middle Ages, once dismissed as esoteric babble, were now combed for hidden formulas. Anything referencing mercury, sulfur, salta, tria prima of transformation was catalogued in the growing occult library of the Ahnenerbe. They believed alchemy was a forgotten technology, not superstition, but ancient knowledge encrypted in metaphor, a poetic science preserved in riddles to protect it from the unworthy. And they were the worthy. They sought its many promises: transmutation of metals, because gold meant power, not just economic but mystical. Gold was considered perfected matter. Nazis theorized that by understanding this process, they could find new materials, new fuels, or, if rumors are true, develop exotic weapon compounds resistant to modern physics. The elixir of life. Tied to the Philosopher's Stone, this was said to cure disease and prolong life. Nazi biologists conducted brutal experiments on prisoners, testing blood transfusions, adrenal extracts, and bizarre tonics rumored to have alchemical origins, always with the same goal: control over mortality. Creation of homunculi. One of the most disturbing subtexts of Nazi alchemy was the ancient legend of artificially created beings, little men born in flasks. Not myth. Prototype. Some Nazi occultists saw in this the origin of genetic engineering, a pathway to designer soldiers, bioautomatons grown in secret labs, carrying no soul, only obedience. Whether they actually tried to build one is unknown, but records show chillingly close parallels in the human experimentation that took place at concentration camps, where racial science and mystical madness merged. And then there were the alchemical symbols. The Reich wasn't content with using runes. They began incorporating alchemical glyphs into architecture, uniforms, ritual tools, circles within circles, triangles and squares. The red lion, the white king, the peacock's tail, diagrams that once guided spiritual rebirth were now guiding genocide. Some believe that Wellsburg Castle was designed as an alchemical chamber in itself, a massive symbolic furnace in which the new man could be forged. Each level, each chamber, representing a stage of transmutation. Nigredo, blackening; albedo, whitening; rubedo, reddening; death, purification, resurrection. It was cult logic dressed in bureaucracy, a political machine powered by myth. But the most chilling part? They believed alchemy wasn't dead. They believed it had simply gone underground, that secret societies, Rosicrucians, Templars, the Order of the Golden Dawn had preserved the knowledge, and that if the Reich could track them down, they could reclaim the hidden fire. They infiltrated lodges, interrogated mystics, looted private libraries. Every occult thread was followed back to its source, no matter how tangled. Because if the world was built from base matter, then it could be reforged. Burn the old lead, make new gold. Burn the old world, make the Third Reich. But what if alchemy could only go so far? What if even the elixir of life had an expiration date? Then they'd need something stronger. A final secret. A path not just to long life, but to eternal existence. Which brings us to the Nazis' most fevered, desperate obsession of all. Secrets of immortality. Secrets of immortality. For most people, death is the end. For the Nazis, it was just poor planning. They weren't building a regime to last a generation, or even a century. They were constructing a millennial empire, and they knew that would require more than steel and gunpowder. It would require time. Unlimited time. So they chased it. Not metaphorically, literally. They pursued the secrets of immortality with the same fervor they applied to tanks and terror. And they believed, truly believed, that the key lay buried in the ashes of lost civilizations, the margins of ancient texts, the symbols carved into bones and gold. The Ahnenerbe devoted entire divisions to the study of longevity myths. Their archives overflowed with legends of deathless sages, ever-living kings, and secret elixirs. From Gilgamesh to Qin Shi Huang, they traced the footsteps of those who had tried before and failed. But failure, to them, was an invitation. First came the scientific route. Nazi medical researchers launched grotesque experiments in pursuit of cellular regeneration. Prisoners were exposed to extreme conditions: cold, heat, vacuum-like pressure to test human thresholds. Glands were harvested. Hormone treatments were trialed. Blood transfusions were performed between prisoners and SS officers in hopes that vital energy could be transferred. There were rumors of fetal cell injections, of adrenaline harvesting, of experimenting with pituitary glands and bone marrow in a hellish quest for a rejuvenation serum. The logic? If youth is chemical, synthesize it. If aging is decay, reverse it. Then came the mythological route. The Nazis became obsessed with tales of immortals hidden in mountains, caves, or templesmen who had lived for hundreds of years by tapping into ancient power. In India, they studied the concept of the Chiranjeev, eternal beings destined to live until the end of time. In Tibet, they hunted for lamas, rumored to have lived for centuries, believing their rituals were keys to halting death. Even vampires weren't off the table. Ahnenerbe occultists studied Eastern European folklore not for entertainment, but for leads. Could the blood of the young sustain the old? Could ancient rites of blood exchange offer longevity? Some researchers believed the vampire myths were degraded memories of an elite caste that had mastered bioalchemical life extension. And then came the esoteric route. Wellsburg Castle, again, was central. The SS believed that death was not the end of the self, but a transition, that the soul could be anchored, recycled, or better yet, contained. They theorized that certain rituals could bind the consciousness of elite SS officers to the castle itself, like spiritual data stored in a sacred drive. The 12-seat ritual hall? Not a meeting room. A resurrection engine. The idea was this: through enough willpower, blood purity, and ceremonial precision, a being could refuse death, could upload their essence into the land, into an object, into the genetic code of the Volk. A living memory, a deathless state. A few particularly unhinged theorists even posited that the ancient runes held formulas for soul anchoring, a kind of Aryan necromancy. They believed Odin did not die on the tree, but transcended it. And they wanted to do the same. And always, they returned to the same obsession: the blood. Because for the Nazis, Blood wasn't just symbolic, it was hardware. A vessel. A relic. They believed pure Aryan blood could carry ancestral memory, latent knowledge, perhaps even spiritual immunity. And so, immortality wasn't just about the self, it was about the race. By preserving the bloodline, they believed, they were preserving eternal life. It all led to grotesque rationalizations for eugenics, genocide, and genetic control, not just because they hated the other, but because they believed their survival depended on it. Death was not acceptable. Others could die, must die. But they, the chosen, the awakened, must live forever. They didn't find it, of course. They died like everyone else, coughing in bunkers, hanging from ropes, bleeding in snow. But the idea didn't die. It slithered into post-war occultism, survivalist cults, fringe science. Today, echoes of Nazi immortality dreams pulse through conspiracy theories and alt-history fantasies, like cold electricity. But immortality was only one half of the puzzle. The other half? Origin. Because to live forever, you have to understand where you came from, who you were before the gods fell silent, who built the pyramids before history began. And so, the Reich turned its eyes to the land of eternal monuments. Ancient Egyptian mysteries. Ancient Egyptian mysteries. If you stare at the Great Pyramid long enough, your brain starts to believe it wasn't built by humans. The angles, the alignments, the impossible scale. It whispers of secrets baked into sandstone, of gods who use geometry as language and death as a doorway. To the Nazis, Egypt wasn't just the cradle of civilization. It was a temple of lost technology, and possibly a waypoint in the migration of the Aryan super race. Though their obsession with Egypt wasn't as publicly paraded as their Arctic and Andean delusions, behind the heavy doors of the Ahnenerbe archives, Egypt loomed large. Not just as a tourist fascination or a colonial trophy, but as a code, one they believed could be cracked with enough stolen scrolls, occult insight, and esoteric mathematics. They began with the pyramids, of course. The Reich's occult scholars saw the pyramids not as tombs, but as machines, devices that once harnessed cosmic energy, focused telluric currents, or stored divine knowledge. They theorized that the Great Pyramid was a reactor, not metaphorically, but technologically designed by a race that understood the lost laws of the universe. Some believed it was part of a global energy grid linked to other megaliths like Stonehenge, Tiwanaku, and Angkor Wat, a network of sacred geometry activated by planetary alignments. And the Aryans? The original engineers. The swastika carved into Egyptian tombs? Proof, they said, not of cross-cultural symbol diffusion but of ancient Aryan rule. Then came the sacred texts. SS researchers pored over translations of the Book of the Dead, reading it not as funerary poetry, but as an instruction manual for spiritual transformation. The ritual steps of the soul's journey through the underworld were reinterpreted as a psychic initiation process, a blueprint for crossing dimensions, or reincarnating into a higher, purer form. Himmler reportedly kept a copy near his bedside. There were darker theories, too. Some Nazi occultists speculated that the mummification process was an early form of preserving spiritual energy, that by wrapping the body, preparing it with oils, and burying it with spells, the Egyptians were preserving consciousness, not just corpses. They studied the placement of organs, the shapes of canopic jars, the hieroglyphs etched onto sarcophagi. One Ahnenerbe report even suggested that the Egyptians had discovered a method to pause the soul in transit, creating a kind of afterlife limbo. With the right ritual, that soul could be recalled, reanimated. The Reich envisioned ways to adapt these rites. They imagined combining Egyptian mortuary knowledge with German blood science, a necro-alchemical fusion that could lead to a kind of racial resurrection. Not just eternal life, but engineered rebirth. They even theorized that the pharaohs were Aryan ruler stall, noble-featured, ruling over a lesser race of workers. Nonsense, of course, but convenient nonsense, the kind that supported their delusions of racial inheritance. And so, Egypt became another mirror, another stolen myth distorted into Nazi reflection. They sent scholars to Cairo, acquired artifacts through diplomatic channels, and looted private collections. Some reports suggest that Ahnenerbe agents sought access to restricted temple sites, especially those rumored to house underground chambers. And those chambers? You guessed it. Ancient libraries. Vaults of Atlantean knowledge. Hidden technology. Forgotten rites. They believed that beneath the sands of Giza, a chamber lay sealed untouched since the flood-holding scrolls, machines, or even living beings in stasis. Hyperborean remnants, immortals, waiting for the call. But they never found them. The desert gave them nothing. And so, they moved on, their hunger unsatisfied, their ideology craving confirmation. If the sands couldn't speak, maybe the skies could. And if no answers came from above, they would dig deeper, higher up, colder, toward a realm whispered about in Tibetan and Hindu myth, a plateau of gods, a mountain of memory. They were going back to the Himalayas. To the hidden knowledge in the Himalayas. Hidden knowledge in the Himalayas. They had already gone to Tibet once, but they didn't stop there. Because for the Nazis, the Himalayas weren't just a place. They were a door, a gate to something other, older than civilization, higher than gods. A place where knowledge slept not in books, but in mountains. They believed the Himalayas held secrets buried under ice and legend. Not just mystical teachings, but maps, blueprints, instructions for awakening a new race, not metaphors manuals. And the Reich intended to read them. Whispers of this belief trace back to the 1938-1939 SS Tibet expedition, but that was only the beginning. The Himalayas became a central symbol in Nazi esoteric thought, a spiritual axis. The spine of the earth, where ancient power still hummed, waiting for the right initiates to decode it. So what were they looking for? Secret texts. Not scriptures. Blueprints. Hidden in monasteries, buried in caves, written on leather, silk, or human skin. The Ahnenerbe sought Dzogchen scrolls, tantras, ritual manuals, rumored to contain practices for accessing higher planes of consciousness, not for enlightenment, but for enhancement, for weaponization. They believed these documents might explain how to prolong life, control thought, or manipulate the human nervous system with mantras, breath, and visualization. In Nazi hands, ancient yogic practices became a kind of spiritual hacking. What if you could trigger aggression, absolute obedience, vision beyond the visible? Secret places. The myth of Padmasambhava's hidden spiritual treasures buried in rock, snow, and space itself drew special interest. Himmler and his inner circle believed these time-release teachings might have been left by beings of a higher order. Perhaps ancient Aryans, perhaps extraterrestrials, perhaps gods. Monasteries in Nepal, Bhutan, and India were scouted. Nazi-funded explorers made inquiries into remote Himalayan regions, some so inaccessible they had never been properly mapped. The Reich reportedly sought to acquire ancient maps and geomantic charts showing supposed ley lines, dragon veins of spiritual energy. Secret masters. Tibetan and Hindu legends speak of Mahasiddhas beings who mastered reality, time, and even death. Some traditions claim they never died, only withdrew from the visible world. Nazi occultists, in their typical fashion, twisted this into a racial narrative. What if these were Aryans in exile, hidden gurus, holding the last strands of world-making knowledge? They believed the mountains might still house them, in caves, in temples invisible to those with impure sight. The idea was simple. If you were worthy, the Himalayas would open. And they tried to be worthy. SS initiates underwent esoteric, training silent meditations, fasting, exposure to cold, rhythmic breathing. They weren't seeking nirvana, they were trying to tune in, hoping to catch a frequency buried under snow, encoded in mantra, or hidden in rock vibrations. They thought the Himalayas might be a natural and 10th world's spiritual North Pole, broadcasting ancient instructions. They theorized that its peaks aligned with celestial constellations, channeling energy to Earth, and at the center of this web, Kailash, the sacred mountain, unclimbed, untouchable, worshipped across religions, believed by some to be the throne of Shiva, by others the axis of the world. Nazi occultists considered Kailash a likely candidate for the entrance to Shambala, or Agartha, or something deeper, something older, a repository of the first science. Some even theorized that inside the mountain was a machine, not gears and wires but sound, vibration, a consciousness amplifier left by a civilization that predated language. And if the Nazis could enter and survive, they could control that machine. They didn't get far. The Himalayas swallowed them whole. Their efforts collapsed under geography, resistance, and war. No maps, no monks, no machines. But the idea stuck. To this day, the Nazi-Himalaya connection fuels conspiracy theories, occult thrillers, and speculative documentaries. Shambala, the abominable snowman, alien temples, Nazi UFOs. Because the Nazis weren't just searching for power, they were haunted by it. They believed something had been lost, something stolen. And if it couldn't be found in scrolls or statues, maybe it was buried in the earth itself. In places that bled energy. Ancient power sites. Ancient power sites. The earth, the Nazis believed, was not just a planet, it was a machine. A living grid. A geomantic skeleton pulsing with invisible energy currency lines, telluric fields, dragon veins, and scattered across this grid were nodes places where the lines converged, where the power boiled closest to the surface, sacred places, ancient power sites. And like everything else they touched, the Nazis didn't approach these sites with reverence. They came to harvest. The Ahnenerbe cataloged these locations obsessively. From Stonehenge to Delphi, from the Externstein to the Great Pyramid, they mapped what they believed to be a global network of spiritual reactors. Points where the ancients had once tapped into Earth's core to build, transform, and possibly ascend. To them, these weren't random ruins. They were charging stations. Temples weren't places of worship, they were conductors, aligned to stars, tuned to solstices, vibrating with harmonics. The Nazis believed the ancients read. The Aryan had once built these places to interface with Earth's energy system. The knowledge was lost, but the architecture remained. All they had to do was turn it back on. Enter geomancyth, pseudoscience of Earth energy mapping. Nazi occultists and scientific dowsers, yes, that was a thing, used pendulums, divining rods, and magnetic field detectors to locate high-energy spots. They walked circles around megaliths, measured magnetism at dolmens, charted vibrations on rune stones. They claimed that these sites emitted frequencies that could alter consciousness, influence behavior, or even induce visions. The ultimate goal? Military application. If you could amplify fear, courage, or loyalty using ambient energy, imagine the possibilities. One SS memo even proposed building barracks and schools near ancient sites to passively influence the psychological development of Nazi youth. The Earth itself would become an indoctrination engine. And then there were the ceremonies. Welsburg Castle, the Reich's Black Heart, was built on a power point, aligned with ancient Germanic ley lines. Its north tower crowned with the black sun was meant to be the Reich's spiritual engine, tapping into earth energy and channeling it into the SS elite. At the Externstein, torchlit rituals took place during solstices. SS officers stood in formation among the stones, reenacting rites they believed their ancestors had performed millennia earlier, rituals of renewal, sacrifice, and cosmic connection. It wasn't just about symbols. It was about interface. They saw these sites as control panels, and they wanted to figure out which button to push. Some sites were chosen based on mathematical models, the golden ratio, sacred geometry, and astronomical alignments. Others were chosen by divination, visions, or psychics employed by the Onnerbe. If someone felt something, that was enough. Their belief was absolute. The earth could be a partner, a weapon, and they were building the code. There's even a fringe theory that the Nazis planned to build a global grid of temples, reviving the old network of power points, connected by sacred architecture, magnetic resonators, and psychic nodes. A planetary web of control and invocation. But the war broke the circuit. Bombs fell. Castles burned. Sacred sites returned to silence. The earth exhaled. Still, the idea lingers. Today, you can find maps online that trace ley lines across continents. Some trace back to Nazi sources. They intersect at Stonehenge, the pyramids, the Vatican, and yes, Wellsburg. Because when you believe power is in the ground, you will go to any length to dig it up. Even if it means chasing myths so obscure, they border on chemistry fiction. Next, we turn to something so rare, so impossible, it might not exist at all. But that didn't stop the Reich from wanting it. The universal solvent. The universal solvent. The alchemists called it alkahest, a mythical substance, invisible, immaterial, capable of dissolving any material in existence, metal, stone, even gold, without altering itself. The universal solvent. It was the dream of total transformation. And to the Nazis, it was something far more sinister, the ultimate weapon of erasure. They didn't want to study the universe. They wanted to unmake it. And if a mythical substance could turn all matter into formless essence, then it was no longer just alchemite, it was annihilation technology. Alkahest was first whispered into Western minds in the 17th century by Paracelsus and his disciples. To them, it was the key to dissolving the impurities of the world, both physical and spiritual. But Nazi theorists? They didn't want to purify. They wanted to obliterate, to erase history and rebuild it in their image. Some believed the universal solvent was not a substance, but a foreseen aspect of nature lost in time, a particle or wave, something that could disassemble molecular bonds with precision. A zero-point acid, a liquid void, and if they could rediscover it, they could dissolve not just enemies but structures, armored tanks, walls, cities. There are obscure Onnerbe memos that mention complete matter destabilization documents referencing electromagnetic testing involving unknown compounds. The wording is vague, cloaked in the veil of experimental alchemical jargon, but the obsession is clear. Find the thing that undoes all other things. The Nazis didn't just look to history, they looked to myth. In Hermetic texts, the universal solvent was sometimes equated with the prima materiae, original, undifferentiated substance from which the world was formed. The Nazis theorized that if the world was created from a primal essence, then surely it could be returned to that state. Some went even further, linking the concept of alkahest with the Aryan fire of ancient Vedic lore. In Nazi esoteric thought, it became a cosmic elementa forgotten weapon of the Hyperboreans, capable of dissolving impure matter and leaving only the perfect form. They called it cleansing. It was destruction. There were even rumors, likely exaggerated or fabricated after the war, that Nazi scientists were experimenting with a compound meant to mimic the solvent. A mix of mercury derivatives, acids, and heavy metals exposed to electromagnetic radiation. The goal wasn't industrial, it was ritualistic. They wanted to prove they could melt reality. Wellsburg Castle, again, enters the frame. Some claim the North Tower was meant to be the testing chamber, not just for alchemical transformation, but for disintegration. A symbolic site where the old world would be dissolved and the new world would begin. None of it worked, of course. Matter remained stubborn. Reality refused to dissolve, and the only thing the Reich truly managed to reduce to formlessness was Europe itself. But the idea of Alkahest survived. Today, it lives in conspiracy theories, speculative chemistry, and science fiction, a whisper that somewhere, someone still chases the dream of total dissolution. Because the Nazis were not just obsessed with creation, they were obsessed with control. To control death, to control time, to control the elements, and above all to control knowledge. So they turned their eyes toward secret brotherhoods. Organizations that claimed to have preserved ancient truths through fire, exile, and silence. The Reich's next target, the Rosicrucians. Connection to the Rosicrucians. They wore no uniforms. They held no official power. But in the shadows of history, the Rosicrucians whispered of secrets older than empires: alchemy, healing, astral travel, eternal life. A hidden brotherhood of light in a world of darkness. To most, they were a mystical footnote. To the Nazis, they were a thread or a key. It depended on who you asked. The Rosicruciansat, leased by legend, emerged in the early 1600s, announcing themselves through a series of manifestos: Fama Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. These texts spoke of a secret society dedicated to universal wisdom, spiritual transformation, and the reformation of all knowledge. That alone was enough to catch Himmler's eye. But it got deeper. The Rosicrucians claimed descent from ancient mystery schools: Egyptian, Pythagorean, perhaps even Atlantean. They were said to guard sacred truths passed down from civilization to civilization, always in hiding, always one step ahead of destruction, a secret line of philosophical resistance against ignorance and tyranny, which is precisely why the Nazis wanted them dissected or recruited. Himmler believed that the Rosicrucians might hold the last fragments of Aryan sacred science, that their rites, symbols, and encoded texts might conceal knowledge lost during the Christian conquest of pagan Europe. That Christian Rosenkreuz himself was not just a fictional character, but a real initiate of an underground Aryan priesthood. The Ahnenerbe began combing through libraries and private collections looking for Rosicrucian manuscripts. They sent agents to France, the Netherlands, and even England to acquire rare texts. Occult bookstores were raided. Rosicrucian lodges were infiltrated, questioned, sometimes shut down. And there were always the whispers that some Rosicrucians had been targeted for interrogation, their homes searched for hidden documents. Others were said to have disappeared entirely. Because while the Nazis claimed to seek the ancient truths for the glory of the Reich, in truth they were at war with any group that claimed secret wisdom. Control was everything. If the Rosicrucians had mystical methods for healing, channeling energy, or unlocking hidden abilities, the SS wanted them for their own. They wanted the symbols, the rose and cross, the Ouroboros, the sevenfold path, not as tools for spiritual evolution, but as instruments of state power. And, in classic Nazi fashion, they rewrote the narrative. They began pushing a theory that the Rosicrucians were founded by Aryan sages who had fled Atlantis or Hyperoreia, that the rose symbolized blood purity, that the cross was not Christian, but solar. They stripped away the Hermeticism, the Neoplatonism, the Universalism, and rebuilt it as a racial cult. They even tried to recreate it. Within the SS, Himmler proposed founding a modern Rosicrucian order, stripped of foreign contamination, redesigned to serve the blood-based mysticism of the Reich. Welsburg Castle would be its temple. The SS would be its nightly caste. Their rituals would be scientific initiations, guiding members through levels of secret knowledge, all in service of the Nazi mythos. In short, they didn't want to join the Rosicrucians. They wanted to replace them. And yet, for all their paranoia, the Nazis never understood what the Rosicrucians actually represented. Not power, but transformation. Not domination, but awakening. A philosophy of the inner self as alchemist, the world as symbol, the soul as experiment. The Nazis took those symbols and made them tools of war. They were building not a secret brotherhood, but a machine of myth. And nowhere was that more literal than in the castle that stood at the center of their occult universe. A place that was part fortress, part temple, part blueprint for a future where mysticism and murder walked hand in hand. Welsburg Castle's Secrets. Welsburg Castle's Secrets. Welsburg Castle doesn't look like the center of a death cult. It's quiet, cold, nestled in the rolling hills of Westphalia like something out of a grim fairy tale. But behind its stone walls, beneath its arched ceilings, the Third Reich spiritual engine thrummed with ambition, delusion, and darkness. To Heinrich Himmler, this wasn't a castle. It was a temple, a beacon, a ritual machine. Acquired by the SS in 1934, Welsburg was transformed from a crumbling 17th century fortress into the occult Vatican of the Reich. Himmler envisioned it as the ideological heart of a new Aryan religion, a place where history would be rewritten, power would be conjured, and immortality would be engineered. He called it the center of the world, and he meant it literally. The entire North Tower was redesigned according to mystical geometry. At its core was the Obergruppenführersaal circular chamber lined with 12 dark columns and a swastika-adorned ceiling. In the floor, the infamous black Suna symbol never explained, never confirmed, but rumored to be an SS-designed sigil of energy, ancestry, and death. 12 seats encircled the chamber, 12 high-ranking SS officers, envisioned as a modern-day round table of the Blood Order, would gather here. They weren't just generals, they were initiates. Guardians of sacred knowledge, priests in black. And below them? The crypt, a cavernous stone chamber directly beneath the Black Sunday, designed for rituals that blurred the line between funeral and transformation. A central altar, a skylight aimed upward to catch the Black Sunday above. The symbolism was chillingly precise, as above, so below. Some believed it was a place of resurrection. Others said it was for binding the souls of the fallen SS into the land itself. One plan never completed called for the crypt to be filled with the ashes of the 12 Obergruppenführers. Their spirits would remain trapped in the stone, feeding the future with ancestral energy. The castle would become not just a monument, but a battery. Welsburg was built to indoctrinate, not just administrate. Every inch of its reconstruction was coded. The architecture was mapped to sacred geometry, the hallways aligned with solar patterns. Runes were carved into beams. Rooms were themed after mythic heroes and Norse gods. The entire space was engineered to feel eternal, not a castle, a cosmic anchor. Outside the tower, plans were drawn for a massive expansion. A cult city, training grounds for the SS spiritual elite. An academy of racial mysticism where history, biology, and occult science would be fused into one unified doctrine, a Vatican of the New Age. Construction continued, even as war raged. Brick by brick, the future was being summoned. And then it fell. In 1945, as Allied forces closed in, SS troops received orders to destroy the castle. They set charges. Much of it was reduced to rubble, but the North Tower survived. The Black Sunday still remains. The crypt, still breathes cold air. Today, it is a museum, a cautionary monument. But the myths endure. Some say the rituals were never completed, that the 12 chairs remain empty, that somewhere, hidden chambers lie sealed filled with stolen relics, forbidden texts, or the embalmed remains of those who tried to make themselves gods. Others whisper that the Black Sunday was activated just once, that something stirred, that it left an echo. Because Wellsburg wasn't just a headquarters. It was the Reich's arc of obsession. A physical manifestation of every delusion, every ritual, every blood-soaked fantasy they tried to turn into truth. And now, it stands as a cracked mirror, reflecting not power, but madness. But even this wasn't the end of their spiritual excavation, because beneath the stones of their pagan temple, the Nazis sought to resurrect the gods themselves. Which brings us to their most bizarre theological twist of all. Ancient German paganism. Ancient German paganism. Before Christianity, before Rome, before the swastika spun its black lie across the world, there were the woods. Dark, cold, sacred. In the Nazi imagination, ancient Germany wasn't a backwater of tribal chaos. It was a holy land, a pre-Christian Eden where the true Aryans worshipped blood, soil, and sky, where gods walked barefoot through pine needles and warriors died, not for salvation, but for honor. And the Nazis wanted it back. They didn't want to imitate ancient Germanic paganism. They wanted to resurrect it, rebuild it, rewrite it, craft a new mythology from broken statues, distorted sagas, and ritual fragments stitched together with pseudo-history and nationalist rage. At the head of this spiritual necromancy was, once again, Heinrich Himmler. To Himmler, Christianity was an infectiona Roman, Jewish, alien force that had derailed the natural spiritual evolution of the Aryan race. He saw the Christianization of Germany as a historical tragedy, the burning of sacred groves, the smashing of runestones, the silencing of ancestral gods. So he set out to undo it. The plan was radical. A complete replacement of Christianity with a blood-based, nature-rooted religion built on ancient Germanic belief systems. Wellsburg Castle would serve as the High Temple. The SS would be its priesthood. And ancient German pagan is reborn and racialized would be its gospel. But which gods? The Nazis turned to the Norse and Germanic pantheon. Odin, the wisdom, seeker and war, father, Thor, the hammer, bearing protector of order, Tyr, the one-handed god of sacrifice. But they didn't worship them in any traditional sense. They recast them. These weren't divine figures, they were prototypes. Mythic symbols of Aryan idealism, strength, loyalty, purity, sacrifice. Odin's self-hanging, a metaphor for SS initiation. Thor's hammer, a symbol of force through law. The gods were not meant to be served, they were meant to be embodied. Rituals were reconstructed or invented outright. SS marriages were performed at solstices with rune-inscribed rings. Funerals invoked ancient burial rites, rebranded with Nazi aesthetics. Oak branches, flame, incantations of loyalty to the Volk. Yule was celebrated with sun wheels and black candles, not to honor Christ, but the sun, the bloodline, the cycle. Festivals were renamed, churches were quietly discouraged, hymns were replaced with folk chants. Even the German calendar was being rewritten, stripped of saints, and filled with Aryan anniversaries. And always the runes, always the blood. Genealogy became sacred. You didn't just descend from your ancestors, you inherited their spiritual energy. You were a vessel, a continuation of ancient will. To defy the race was to defy the gods themselves. The Ahnenerbe began reconstructing mythologies from fragments, regional folktales, Eddaic verse, Roman accounts of Germanic tribes. They pieced together rituals with all the precision of a lunatic archaeologist, gluing a skeleton together out of chicken bones. But they didn't care about accuracy. They cared about effect, because this wasn't about belief. It was about power. Religion as statecraft, paganism as policy, mythology as mind control. And yet, even within their fabricated religion, a deeper hunger burned. They weren't satisfied with statues and chants. They wanted proof, sacred texts, holy artifacts, relics of an ancient European Gnosticism that might validate their new faith. And they believed they found it in the south of France. In the ruins of Cathar castles, buried in blood and legend, beneath the whispers of heretics and knights who died for a secret that could have changed the world. A secret the Nazis believed pointed directly to the Holy Grail. Next, the Cathars and the Grail. The Cathars and the Grail. In the sun-baked hills of southern France, near the ruins of Montségur, the stones whisper. They tell of fire, of betrayal, of heretics burned alive beneath the walls of their final fortress in 1244. But to the Nazis, especially Otto Ranti's, wasn't just a medieval massacre, it was a mystery, a buried treasure, a cosmic key, because the Catharsin obscure Christian sect, branded heretical by the Church, were believed by some Nazi theorists to be the last guardians of the Holy Grail. Not the chalice of Christ, not a relic of blood and wine, but a vessel of knowledge, a machine, a code, a philosophy so powerful it could reshape reality. And the Nazis wanted it. Otto Rahn was a romantic, a failed academic, a man who drifted into the orbit of the SS because his obsessions matched theirs. Ancient secrets, lost religions, and the ultimate myth of redemption through blood and fire. He was sent to France under Ahnenerbe patronage in the early 1930s to investigate Cathar ruins, Montségur, Château de Montaillou, the caves of Ussat. He searched not just for relics but for clues. Grail symbols etched in stone, alignments in architecture, references to a hidden treasure spirited away before the Cathars fell. And he found something, or said he did. He published books claiming that the Cathars were the spiritual descendants of ancient Indo-European Gnostics, keepers of a secret wisdom passed down from Atlantis, through the Essenes, into the Templars, and finally to the doomed Cathar perfecti. His theory? The Grail wasn't a cup. It was knowledge, perhaps even a physical object from another world, Atlantean, Hyperborean, divine, something that gave power to the worthy, something that let the initiated see through the illusion of history. The SS devoured it. Rahn was elevated to honorary rank, given a budget, a typewriter, a mission. And as he wandered the Pyrenean wilds, he began to draw maps, sketch runes, compare cave markings with ancient alphabets. He linked Cathar theology, which rejected the material world and saw Earth as a prison, with Nazi esotericism, which sought spiritual escape through racial purification. Two insane systems, finding symmetry. He began speaking of a Grail trail path that led from Montségur to secret chambers deep beneath the mountains, where the last Cathars had hidden the object, or the knowledge, or both. Did he find it? We don't know. Rahn's story ends in mystery. In 1939, his body was found in a snowdrift in Tyrol. Official cause, suicide. Unofficial cause, he knew too much, or too little, or crossed the wrong circle. Or maybe, like so many true believers, he realized the truth didn't exist, and he couldn't live with the lie. But his death didn't kill the idea. The Grail remained a fixation, not as a Christian relic, but as a universal symbol, the eternal quest for wholeness, power, escape. The Nazis believed that the Cathars had held a piece of it, that the Grail had always been an Aryan secret, hijacked by the Church, buried by time. Some even connected it to Tibet, claiming the Grail legends were distorted memories of Shambala. Others saw it as a Vril conduita psychic amplifier used by ancient priest kings to communicate across time and dimension. But all agreed on one thing: the Grail was real, and it had to be found. If not in France, then elsewhere. Perhaps in another sunken land, lost before time. Because while the Cathars were noble and tragic, they were still a branch. The root, the origin, the motherland of Aryan legend. Was Atlantis? But what if there was more than one lost continent? What if Atlantis wasn't unique? What if it had siblings? Lost continents, beyond Atlantis. Lost continents, beyond Atlantis. Atlantis wasn't the end. For the Nazi mythmakers, it was just the first breadcrumb, the most famous name in a global saga of forgotten supercontinents, shattered by cataclysm, buried beneath oceans and time. Because if there was one Atlantis, surely there were others. Lemuria, Mu, Kumari Kandam, Pacifica. To the world, these names were speculative, myth, New Age, fog, and fringe maps. To the Nazis, they were coordinates. They weren't just hunting one lost homeland. They were building a submerged Hyperoreia chain of sunken Aryan colonies that once ringed the earth like pearls on a necklace, forming a prehistoric golden age. And they believed they were its return. The idea was simple. Atlantis was real. It fell, but it wasn't alone. Lemuria, they claimed, stretched across the Indian Ocean home to tall, fair-skinned, spiritual giants. Mu spanned the Pacific, a luminous kingdom of high technology and ritual science. Kumari Kandam was India's own drowned land, a Vedic Atlantis swallowed by the sea. Each name, to them, pointed to the same truth. The Earth was once governed by a global Aryan theocracy, technologically advanced and racially pure. And after the great floods caused by comets, ice moons, or magnetic reversal depending on your flavor, the survivors spread, becoming the founders of every civilization. The Ahnenerbe created mapsarchaeo-mythological atlases combining Plato, Blavatsky, Theosophy, Hindu epics, Polynesian oral traditions, and colonial folklore into a single psychotic cartography. Continents that never existed were plotted with fake coordinates and layered with swastika migration paths. They even incorporated Darwinian blasphemy. According to some Nazi theorists, evolution didn't move in Africa. It moved underwater. They proposed that Lemuria had been home to the first Aryans, who were spiritually perfect, mentally advanced, and physically superior. They didn't evolve. They devolved when scattered among impure populations after the flood. Thus, history became a racial bell curve. Golden Age Aryans at the top, modern humans as the deluded, degenerate dregs, and of course, only the Nazis had the bloodline to climb back up. So, what did they look for? Underwater ruins, reports from divers in the Azores, sonar readings off the coast of Japan, rock formations off Yonaguni. Any anomaly beneath the seafloor became suspect. Could it be a submerged temple? A forgotten port? They never found proof, but they found patterns, and patterns were enough. Myths of white gods. Indigenous stories from Central and South America spoke of tall, bearded strangers arriving long before Columbus, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha. To Nazi eyes, these weren't local legends. They were racial memory, evidence that ancient Aryan navigators had circled the globe. Ancient maps. The Piri Reis map, the Zeno chart. They obsessed over pre-modern cartography, showing ice-free Antarctica or continents that shouldn't exist. Proof, they claimed, of knowledge handed down from submerged supercivilizations. Sacred geometry. They searched for repeated forms, pyramids, spirals, aligned megaliths. They believed the same mathematical ratios used in Egypt, Mexico, and Indonesia were leftovers from a single lost source, perhaps Mu. And behind every angle, Aryan architects, But it wasn't just about finding ruins. It was about justifying conquest. If every land had once been ruled by Aryans, then every land was theirs to reclaim. The swastika was not a new banner, it was a returning standard. A symbol that once flew over Atlantis, Lemurian would soon fly over the world again. And so, the quest for lost continents became a mythological real estate plan, a cosmology with borders, a theology with latitude and longitude. But even that wasn't the end. Because if the world was once perfect, built by Aryans and drowned in Synthen, the future must bring that perfection back. A world not just returned, but reborn. And that required proof of something even more delusional than a lost continent. That the past was better. That there once existed a golden age of human perfection. One the Nazis swore they could restore. Next, proof of a golden age. Proof of a golden age. To the Nazis, the future wasn't a straight line. It was a circle. A vast, cosmic Ouroboros devouring its own tail, where history wasn't progress, but repetition, decline, collapse, and, eventually, rebirth. At the core of this belief was the myth of a golden agea, time before time, when mankind lived in harmony with the gods, before corruption, chaos, and racial impurity shattered paradise. An age of heroes, of perfection, of Aryan supremacy stretched across a pristine earth. And the Nazis were obsessed with proving it. Not just through myth, through evidence. They believed that if they could uncover real, physical signs of this golden age, they could justify their agenda not as revolutionaries, but as restorers, not changing the world, returning it to what it had once been. So they scoured the earth for traces of perfection, artifacts too advanced for their time. From Piri Reis's map to the Antikythera mechanism, the Ahnenerbe hunted for anomalous ancient tools, designs, and constructions that suggested the world had once known, and lost, a higher science. The theory. These weren't flukes. They were remnants of a global Aryan technocracy. Atlantis's ghost in the gears. Architecture beyond explanation. How did primitive humans build the pyramids? The trilithons of Baalbek? Machu Picchu? Nazi theorists claimed it wasn't primitive humanity at all, but hyper-evolved Aryan descendants, survivors of the flood. Their blood memory still echoing in stone. Genetic superiority frozen in art. They combed through ancient sculptures, busts, and frescoes looking for Aryan features: straight noses, high foreheads, light eyes. When they found such traits in Egypt or India or Mesoamerica, they claimed these were not local rulers but remnants, evidence that Aryans had once ruled the world before sinking beneath the tides of history. Literature and myth that spoke of a fall. The Garden of Eden, Satya Yuga, the Age of Kronos, the Dream Time. Nazi ideologues believed every culture's tale of a lost paradise pointed to the same event, the end of Aryan dominance. A fall not from grace but from power. The idea that the present was inferior wasn't revolutionary, it was ancient, and the Nazis twisted it into fuel for their engine of rebirth. If they could prove a perfect past existed, then a perfect future was not utopian fantasy. It was inevitable. They called it the eternal return, a distorted Nietzschean concept turned racial prophecy. The world had fallen, yes, but the cycle was turning. The flood had passed. The ruins had been decoded. And the new Aryans, the Nazis, would rise from the ashes and recreate the golden era with tanks, uniforms, and rune magic. Welsburg Castle was meant to be its Vatican, the SS, its holy order, Hitler, its demiurge. And the process had already begun. Education was being redesigned to reflect ancient warrior ideals. Rituals reinstated, holidays rebranded, bloodlines traced like royal trees. The past wasn't just studied, it was reenacted. They believed the Golden Age had ended in fire and water. They believed they would bring it back in steel and flame. But one problem remained. The Golden Age had not vanished by accident. It had been predicted, and if prophecy could be made once, it could be made again. So the Nazis turned to those who claimed to speak for the future. They studied the ancient methods of divination, desperate for a glimpse of the coming storm. Next, ancient divination methods. Ancient divination methods. If you can't control time, the next best thing is to see through it. The Nazis didn't just want to rewrite the past, they wanted to foresee the future, and they believed the ancients had already cracked the code. From the bones of beasts to the movement of stars, from smoke to scrying mirrors, the Third Reich turned its gaze toward divination. Not as superstition, as technology. Ancient tech, buried in ritual, wrapped in metaphor, waiting to be decoded and repurposed. The Ahnenerbe created an entire department dedicated to the study of pre-modern prophecy. Their mission? To catalog every known method of predicting fate and determine whether any could be scientifically reactivated or militarily weaponized. Because if the ancients could see the future, then so could the SS. Rune casting was a favorite. Germanic tribes once used rune stones to cast lots and interpret omens. To the Nazis, this wasn't folk magicy, was ancestral coding. Each rune was believed to represent not just a letter, but a principle, a law of nature, a force that could be invoked or channeled. SS officers carried rune talismans. Divination rituals using runes were performed before key decisions. Even the design of Nazi insignias was reportedly influenced by runic omens discovered during these rituals. Astrology wasn't far behind. Himmler had a personal astrologer. Horoscopes were drawn for major military operations. Birth charts were requested for high-ranking officers. Even Hitler's campaigns were sometimes rumored to be timed according to celestial alignments. The belief? That planetary motion influenced human behavior and that Aryan blood resonated more strongly with the stars. They looked to the I Ching, the ancient Chinese book of changes, and tried to translate it through an Aryan lens. The hexagram sich, representing a pattern of change, were viewed as part of a cosmic feedback loop, not unlike their obsession with cycles, golden ages, and eternal returns. The Nazis even dabbled in geomancy, interpreting patterns in dirt, sand, or stones, a handful of soil tossed and studied like entrails. What does the land say? They asked, especially in areas where they planned settlements or mass graves. But the darkest forms of divination weren't about symbols. They were about sacrifice. Some Ahnenerbe theorists believed that the ancients read the future not in stars or runes, but in blood. They studied Roman haruspicythe reading of entrails, Aztec heart-offering rituals, Druidic accounts of human divination, where the screams of the dying were interpreted like notes from the gods. And from these sources, they developed experimental rituals, always in secret, always off the books, conducted on prisoners whose final moments were treated as messages from the void. They believed the moment of death unlocked a channel, that a properly conducted death, ritualized, symbolic, timed, could yield visions, that the body, in its final heartbeat, might predict what comes next. This was not fortune-telling, it was fate-forcing. And it all looped back to their core belief that the future was not random. It was structured, patterned, knowable. And once it was known, it could be conquered. But prophecy wasn't enough. Seeing the future meant nothing if they didn't understand how the ancients fought not just with spears and swords, but with spirit. So next, they studied the hidden arts of war. Because maybe it wasn't just tactics that won battles. Maybe it was magic. Next, the secrets of ancient warfare. The secrets of ancient warfare. To most of the world, ancient warfare means swords and sandals, bronze helmets, phalanxes, chariots thundering into the dust. To the Nazis, it meant something else entirely. They weren't interested in tactics. They wanted techniques, rituals, forces beyond the visible. Because to them, the battlefield wasn't just a place of strategy, it was a sacred theater where the blood of warriors didn't just spill, it activated ancient powers. So they set out to uncover the spiritual science of war. Their belief that the ancients didn't just fight physically, they fought magically, that battles were rites, that victories were decided not just by strength or cunning, but by who had the favor of the gods, or better yet, the correct psychic configuration. Germanic war cults were their first obsession. They studied the berserkers, Norse warriors, who fought in a trance-like fury, supposedly immune to pain, often naked, foaming at the mouth, wielding axes with supernatural speed. The Ahnenerbe theorized that berserker states were not insanity, but induced rituals activated through mushrooms, chanting, and deep breathing techniques, early bioweapons of the blood. SS training documents explored how these trance states could be replicated. Experiments were conducted on ways to unleash controlled rage through chemical enhancers, visual stimuli, even hypnotic suggestion. They weren't training soldiers. They were trying to make war shamans. They turned to the Romans, to especially the cult of Mithras, whose rituals were bathed in blood and secrecy. The Mithraic temples underground, symbolic, filled with astronomical codes, were seen as military initiation chambers where elite units were spiritually transformed into unstoppable death engines. To Nazi theorists, this wasn't myth. It was doctrine. Then came the Hindu epics. The Mahabharata and Ramayana described ancient wars waged with divine weapon sastras that could summon fire, wind, and disease. The Brahmastra, said to be the equivalent of a nuclear bomb. Nazi occultists devoured these texts, convinced they weren't metaphor, but tech manuals for lost weaponry. They interpreted the chariots Vimanasas, flying warships powered by sound or Vril energy. The battles? Not legends, historical records from an age before the flood. In Nazi myth, the Aryans were the original warriors, and ancient warfare was their forgotten art. They scoured Celtic sagas for tales of war cries that killed. They studied the shields of Scythian tribes for resonance frequencies. They examined Zulu war dances not for culture, but for neurological programming. Because the battlefield was about control. Control of the mind. Control of fear. Control of reality. They began developing their own hybrid rituals combining runes, geometry, rhythm, and violence. Initiation rites for SS officers involved oath-taking ceremonies that mimicked ancient warrior covenants. Sword circles, blood pacts, symbolic deaths and rebirths. Some SS divisions even conducted pre-battle rune rituals, believing they could summon ancestral protection or tap into the racial memory of past victors. And of course, they believed that spirit mattered more than steel. That a warrior's will could alter the outcome of a fight. That ancient warfare wasn't about weapons but alignment, between the fighter, the earth, the stars, and the past. This belief went so far that some Ahnenerbe researchers proposed that certain battlefields were sacred spaces, and that fighting on them without the proper ritual would ensure defeat. They mapped ancient battle sites and tried to decipher their energy signatures. The idea, fight in the right place, in the right way, with the right symbol and you become invincible. It was delusion, wrapped in ritual. And yet, these beliefs weren't confined to parchment. They were poured into SS training, into architecture, into ideology. Because to the Reich, war wasn't just politics by other means. It was religion. And at the center of that religion was a symbol older than Germany, older than Rome, older than myth itself. A sign found in temples, in ruins, in the stars. One that would become their most infamous emblem. The origins of the swastika. It began long before Hitler. Thousands of years before uniforms and rallies, Before fascism and fire, there was a symbol, a twisted cross, a spiral of motion, a shape so ancient it shows up everywhere, carved into Indian temples, painted on Greek pottery, stamped on Viking swords, etched into Navajo blankets. The swastika. To most cultures, it meant luck, light, the turning of the sun, a symbol of cosmic order, endless cycle, sacred geometry. To the Nazis, it was a calling card, a genetic watermark, the ultimate proof. They didn't see it as a coincidence that the swastika appeared in cultures from India to Iceland. They saw it as confirmation that long before history began, a singular race had left its imprint on the world. That race, they believed, was the Aryans, and the swastika was their sign. The Third Reich didn't adopt the swastika, they resurrected it. And then they weaponized it. Nazi theorists, especially those within the Thule Society and later the Ahnenerbe, became obsessed with tracing the swastika's global journey. They cataloged its appearances in Bronze Age Europe, in Sanskrit texts, on Buddhist statues, and in prehistoric rock carvings. Each new discovery was twisted into a narrative. Look, we were here first. In India, the swastika is a symbol of Vishnu, of solar force. Nazis claimed this as evidence of early Aryan colonization, proof that ancient Indo-European conquerors brought not just language, but spiritual order. In Tibet, they found it in monasteries, often rotating counterclockwise. This inversion fascinated them. Some argued it showed a degradation of the original Aryan symbol. Others believed it was a mirror symbol, hiding deeper esoteric truths. In ancient Germanic and Norse contexts, it appeared as the sunwheel, a symbol of solar power, rebirth, and the eternal turning of fate. Nazis seized on this version, claiming it as the most pure form. And then they redesigned it, rotated it 45 degrees, caged it in white and red, turned a sun symbol into a political logo, a death badge. They drained it of cosmic meaning and filled it with ideology. What had once been a symbol of continuity, of eternity, became a mark of rupture, domination, murder. But they never stopped believing in its original power. Within SS circles, the swastika wasn't just propaganda, it was ritual. Officers wore it not as allegiance, but as armor. Its angles were believed to influence energy, to resonate with blood. Some theorized it created a kind of psychic field around the body, repelling impurity and attracting force. Himmler reportedly had the swastika incorporated into the architecture of Wellsburg Castle at exact harmonic angles based on sacred geometry and the golden ratio. It wasn't decoration, it was function. They even experimented with motion. There are obscure sketches never fully verified of rotating swastika devices, designed to generate electromagnetic energy. The belief was that if the symbol truly channeled cosmic force, then spinning it might unlock hidden frequencies. Nazi engineers tried to fuse ancient symbolism with modern tech. The result? Mostly garbage. But the obsession remained. Because for them, the swastika wasn't just ancient, it was primordial. An echo from before the flood. A sign that the Aryan race was the original blueprint, the architects of civilization, the chosen stewards of the earth. And if that was true, then the symbol would outlast them all. It didn't. The swastika now lies in ruins, its power shattered by its own abuse. What once stood for balance now stands for brutality. But within the Reich, they believed it would return in flags, on temples, on new machines. Some still believe it. Because in the Nazi dream, symbols don't die, they sleep. And maybe, they thought, the swastika was more than a symbol. Maybe it was a signal, a sign from within. Because deep beneath their mythology, beneath the earth itself, the Nazis thought something waited. A hidden race, a secret realm. The inner earth and its inhabitants. Imagine a world beneath your feet. Not just tunnels or caverns, but an entire civilization. A sun beneath the earth, skies under stone, rivers of light, forests of crystal, and a race of beings solder, wiser, stronger watching us through layers of rock. To most, this is pure fantasy, hollow earth theory at its strangest. To the Nazis, it was real estate. Because while some within the Reich subscribed to the idea of a hollow earthen actual hollow shell, with a central soon others refined the theory into something even more esoteric. An inner earth, not empty inhabited, a separate realm beneath the crust, a forgotten Eden sealed away since prehistory. And the beings who lived there? They were the ancestors, the original Aryans, the Hyperboreans, the builders of Atlantis and Lemuria, who, after the cataclysm, retreated underground carrying with them lost knowledge, perfect bloodlines, and the spiritual technology of the gods. The Nazis called this subterranean world by many names: Agartha, Shambala, Asgard reimagined. The idea came from a blend of theosophy, Hindu cosmology, and 19th century adventure fiction. But it was Nazi esoteric thinkers who truly weaponized it. They believed that the inner earth housed a superior civilization, untouched by surface corruption, waiting to emerge when the stars aligned or when summoned by the worthy. And they believed they could make contact. According to some accounts, the SS conducted secret missions to locate possible entrances to the inner earth. Hotspots included the North and South Poles, the Himalayas, the Andes, and deep cave systems in Germany and Austria. Every mountain was suspect, every sinkhole a potential gateway. There are reports shrouded in post-war fog that Nazi U-boats were dispatched to the Antarctic, not just to scout territory, but to find the door. These missions allegedly targeted an area called New Schwabenland where, some say, the Nazis discovered warm water lakes, strange magnetic anomalies, and caverns that went deep. What did they expect to find? A living, Aryan utopia, free from disease, war, or moral decay, guarded by beings either spiritual or physical, who could grant guidance, power, and renewal. The theory was simple. The surface had fallen. The inner earth remained pure. Some Nazi occultists believed these beings were immortal. Others said they were hybrid, part man, part machine, part god. They spoke through telepathy, or symbols, or dreams. And always, they were watching. The Nazis believed that Hitler himself might have been chosen, guided by unseen forces from within the earth, that his rise was no accident, that he was enacting a script written long before human history began. There are even claims, mostly from post-war mythos, that the Reich intended to retreat to the inner earth if the war was lost, that a chosen few were given maps, instructions, or even guides, that a secret base was built beneath Antarctica, that Hitler did not die, but descended. No evidence exists. But to the Nazi mind, evidence was never necessary. Belief was enough. The inner earth wasn't just a myth, it was a mirror, a place where their fantasies of purity, control, and eternity could finally live undisturbed. A spiritual plan B. A kingdom of blood and silence beneath a world of fire and chaos. Because when the Reich looked inward, through myth, through ritual, through murder, they saw not horror. They saw home. But not every secret slept beneath the earth. Some waited on mountaintops, in the ruins of old temples, in the thin air of the Andes. Because the next chapter in the Nazi dream wasn't about who lived beneath us. It was about what they left behind. Mysteries of the Andes. High in the Andes, where oxygen thins and the world turns silent, stone cities cling to cliffs like ghosts. Tiwanaku, Sacsayhuaman, Puma Punku, each more impossible than the last cut stones that fit with machine-like precision, Megaliths weighing hundreds of tons moved as if weightless, all perched thousands of meters above sea level. To the rest of the world, these are wonders. To the Nazis, they were breadcrumbs. Because in these ruins, the Reich didn't just see ancient empires. They saw proof of a lost race, of vanished technology, of Aryan fingerprints etched into the Andes long before the rise of the Inca. It began, as always, with the Ahnenerbe. Expeditions were proposed. Maps were drawn. Rumors followed. But at the center of it all was Edmund Kiss, the Nazi theorist who insisted that Tiwanaku was the oldest city on Earth, built not by indigenous hands, but by Nordic settlers millions of years ago. Yes, millions. Kiss believed that Tiwanaku was the capital of a sunken continent, possibly Atlantis, possibly Lemuria, possibly something else, and that the civilization that built it possessed technology beyond anything modern man had achieved. He pointed to the architecture, the interlocking blocks, the precise angles, the star maps carved into stone. His conclusion? This was no primitive culture. This was a global Aryan outpost, operating before the flood, wiped out by catastrophe, and misunderstood ever since. Kiss theorized that the Gate of the Sun, a massive stone arch at Tiwanaku, was not ceremonial but functional. A calendar, a star tracker, a portal. Some believed it could align with celestial bodies at certain times of the year to open vibrational pathways to other worlds or deep memory banks encoded in DNA. Others thought it was a keyhole to the knowledge stored within the mountain itself. Then came the broader Andean mystery. Nazis believed that South America, like Tibet, was a refuge, a land where survivors from Atlantis or Hyperoreia had fled carrying knowledge, bloodlines, and spiritual technology. They theorized that these Aryan refugees interbred with the locals, giving rise to sudden leaps in Andean architecture, astronomy, and myth. In particular, they obsessed over the legends of Viracochathe, white, bearded god who came from across the sea to teach civilization. To the locals, a deity. To the Nazis, a Nordic sailor. They claimed that elongated skulls found in Peruvian tombs were not deformities, but signs of a different speciestol, pale, advanced. Proto-Aryans. They analyzed the Nazca lines, suggesting they were not religious art, but landing strips either for ancient aircraft or spiritual machines. Others said they were maps, not of Earth, but of the inner Earth, showing entrances, paths, or energetic highways between sacred sites. Artifacts like the Fuente Magna Bowl, bearing what some claim is Sumerian writing, were taken as evidence of transoceanic contact, proof that pre-flood civilizations traveled globally. Again, the implication was clear. If this knowledge existed in the Andes, it must have come from Aryans. But they didn't just seek knowledge. They sought power sites, geographical nodes where Earth energy surged. The Andes are filled with them. Lake Titicaca, Machu Picchu, the Sacred Valley. Nazi geomancers charted these areas as part of a global energy grid and theorized that the ancient Aryans had once connected them in a planetary network of power. So what did the Nazis want? Simple. To plug back in. To find the circuit board of Earth and switch it back on. Through rituals. Through blood. Through conquest. They believed that by activating these ancient sites, they could harness the same energy that once built the impossible and direct it toward the future they were trying to force into being. But they knew they needed more than sites. They needed symbols. They needed signs. And so they looked back to the battlefields of Europe, to a strange tapestry of thread and war. A stitched prophecy. One they believed might contain the secret to empire. Again, the great year and cyclic history. History, the Nazis believed, doesn't move forward. It spirals. This belief central to Nazi esotericism wasn't based on academic historiography or archaeological data. It was rooted in one of the most ancient and seductive myths of all, the Great Year. An immense cosmic cycle, a wheel of time so vast it dwarfs calendars and empires alike. One complete revolution through the ages, golden, silver, bronze, iron, and then collapse, fire, flood. Silence, only to begin again. To ancient civilizations, the Great Year wasn't just poetic metaphor. It was a fact. The Babylonians measured it in the precession of the equinoxes. The Hindus called it the Yuga cycle. The Greeks spoke of Chronos and the eternal return. Plato hinted at it in his dialogues, speaking of a perfect motion of the heavens. And the Nazis? They took it as prophecy. According to Nazi cosmology, history moved in grand archetypes of purity and power, followed by decline and decay. The Golden Age? The time of Aryan perfection, when gods and men shared bloodlines and the world pulsed with harmony. The Iron Age? The present, corrupted, degenerate, diseased. But the cycle, they insisted, was not done. The wheel was turning. And soon, the Golden Age would return. This wasn't optimism. It was fate. The Ahnenerbe pored over ancient texts, astronomical charts, astrological predictions, looking for confirmation. They claimed the coming return of the Golden Age was encoded in Vedic scripture, Druidic lore, Egyptian star maps hidden in allegories, symbols, and mathematical alignments. The swastika itself, they said, was a symbol of this motion, the eternal spin of cosmic time, marking not just energy, but era, a spinning clock without numbers. Each turn, war, rebirth, order, collapse. They believed that great civilizations were not randomly distributed in time. Atlantis, Hyperoreia, Lemuria, all belonged to earlier phases of the Great Year. They rose at the right moment in the cycle, flourished in harmony with the cosmos, and fell when their time passed. What the Nazis sought to prove was this: they were on the upswing. The lowest point of the cycle had passed. The Iron Age was burning out, and their movement, the Reich, was not a new regime, but the inevitable echo of ancient perfection returning. History wasn't moving forward. It was folding back. They interpreted cyclical history as racial destiny. The impure world was crumbling because the time for impurity was over. They believed their rise was cosmologically guaranteed, written in stars, encoded in time. The universe, they claimed, wanted the Aryans back in charge. And so they began marking time differently. They dated SS rituals to ancient solstices, eclipses, and conjunctions. Calendars were altered to reflect not Christian holidays, but celestial events. Some Ahnenerbe documents even proposed a runic calendar based on lunar cycles and astrological alignments. Wellsburg Castle's North Tower was designed to align with certain celestial bodies, because the Nazis didn't just want to observe the Great Year. They wanted to steer it, to be the hands of the clock, not just the watchers. They believed that by performing certain rituals at certain times, they could amplify the cycle, accelerate the shift, collapse the old world faster, trigger the return sooner. A kind of spiritual saboteur warfare against the current age. Of course, none of this worked. The world didn't end. The cycle didn't restart. Their Reich died in ash and ruin, not in golden dawns. But the myth survived. To this day, fragments of Nazi cyclic history linger in far-right occult circles, conspiracy forums, and esoteric fringe cults. The idea that we are at the end of the cycle, that a collapse is coming, and that those who prepare will be the seeds of the next age. But the Nazis didn't just want to survive the collapse. They wanted to resurrect the architects. So, they turned to the stones, to the stars, to the ancient structures that outlived the flood, the fire, and the fall. The secrets of Stonehenge and similar megaliths. In the heart of England, surrounded by sheep and fog, A ring of stone casts a shadow older than empire, Stonehenge. To tourists, it's a photo op. To scholars, a prehistoric observatory. To the Nazis, it was a code, a surviving antenna from a lost civilization, a mechanism of the gods, an open wound in the skin of time, still humming with the echoes of a forgotten race, the race they believed was their own. Stonehenge was more than a monument. It was a machine, a timepiece built not just to track the stars, but to interact with them. The Ahnenerbe believed the megaliths were part of an ancient global network and Aryan communication system, perhaps even a control grid. And Stonehenge was just one node. The Nazis cast their eyes across Europe's ancient bones. The Karnak stones of France, the Goseck Circle in Germany, the dolmens of Scandinavia, the henges, circles, and cairns scattered like runes across the continent. Each one was mapped, measured, aligned. Each one was a clue. They theorized that these stones marked points of geomagnetic power, natural frequencies of the Earth's field that could be harnessed for communication, healing, or control. Ley lines, telluric currents. Earth, electricity. Stonehenge, in particular, was believed to be a spiritual reactor constructed at the crossing of powerful energy lines. The alignment of its stones with solstices wasn't aesthetic, it was functional. Nazi scientists proposed that the site could resonate with the cosmos, allowing ancient Aryan priests to manipulate energy fields, predict cataclysms, or even access higher states of consciousness. Some theories went further. They proposed that megaliths were acoustic structures attuned to certain frequencies, that the chambers and corridors of sites like Newgrange or the Hypogeum of Malta acted as sonic engines, vibrating the human brain into altered states. And who, they asked, had built these? Not druids, not locals, but Hyperboreans, the mythical race from the far north, the Aryan gods before history. According to some in the Ahnenerbe, Stonehenge wasn't built in the Neolithicite, was built before the flood, by a race that fled as waters rose, leaving behind their temples, their machines, their power nodes. Stonehenge was not alone. The Nazca lines, the pyramids of Giza, the Moai of Easter Island, the temples of Anchorage was, they believed, another piece of the system. Each site aligned with others at impossible distances. Each followed sacred geometry golden ratios, Fibonacci spirals, pi. It wasn't coincidence. It was language. They called it the language of earth spoken in stone, measured in light, understood only by the initiated. Some SS documents even theorized that if the correct sequence of sites could be activated, a kind of ancient program might run, triggering a planetary shift. Not metaphysical, physical. Climate, magnetism, consciousness, a global reboot. They began drafting maps, drawing rune grids over megalithic sites, calculating energy flows, ritualizing geography. And again, Wheelsburg was at the center. Its location, shape, and design were said to echo these ancient structures. Some claimed it sat on a forgotten power node, connected to Stonehenge through buried lines of energy. The plan? Build a new megalith, a modern sacred site, not to honor the gods, to replace them, to become the new architects of Earth. But what if those ancient builders weren't gods? What if they weren't even human? Because if the swastika flew over Atlantis, if Stonehenge was an engine, and if the Aryans were the first, brightest flame, then maybe, just maybe, they weren't from here at all. Connections to ancient alien theories, proto-versions. The sky was never just sky to the Nazis. It was a map, a memory, a mirror, and perhaps a runway. While ancient aliens as a pop culture phenomenon didn't bloom until decades later with cable television, questionable documentaries, And memes about Giorgio Tsoukalos's hair, the proto-versions of the theory, were already brewing in the darkest corners of the Nazi mind. They didn't call them extraterrestrials. They didn't need little green men. They had something more dangerous. Aryan gods who came from the stars. To the Ahnenerbe and other Nazi esotericists, ancient myths were never myths. The Vedas, Norse sagas, the Book of Enochal were interpreted as historical records, distorted by time and religion. And behind these records, they believed, were beings vast, intelligent, otherworldly. Not spirits, not deities, but technocrats from a higher dimension. Maybe not from another planet, but from another layer of existence. And those beings, they believed, had seeded Earth with their knowledge, with their blood, with the Aryan race. According to these proto-alien theories, the Aryans were not just superior, they were descendant hybrids of human and celestial origin. Their pale skin, tall stature, and higher faculties weren't evolutionary flukes. They were designed. The myths supported it if you squinted hard enough. In Hindu cosmology, the gods descend in flying chariots, Vimanas raining fire on their enemies. In Norse mythology, the Aesir arrive from across the void, bringing law and knowledge to chaotic Earth. In Sumerian lore, the Anunnaki descend from the heavens, creating kingship and shaping civilization. In Enochian texts, watchers from the sky fall to Earth and sire a race of giants, the Nephilim. To Nazi occultists, these were not coincidences. They were multiple versions of the same story. Ancient non-human beings interacted with early humans, uplifted one group, the Aryans, and left behind clues for their eventual return. This return became a fixation. They believed these ancient beings had retreated into space, into another dimension, or perhaps underground, in Agartha or Shambala. But they would come again, and when they did, they would choose only those worthy of the blood. Some theories went further, that these beings never left, that their technology still existed, buried in megaliths, encoded in runes, hidden in rituals. That by deciphering the right combination of symbols, words, and locations, the Reich could reactivate contact. They looked at the pyramids and saw landing sites. They read the Mahabharata and saw orbital warfare. They studied runestones and saw operating instructions. And they built. There are scattered claims that secret SS labs attempted to create Vril machines, devices designed to tune into cosmic frequencies or communicate with non-human intelligence. One infamous post-war rumor describes a group of Nazi women mediums, the Vril Society, who allegedly received telepathic blueprints from Aldebaran, a star 65 light-years away. They drew sketches, built models. Some say they even tested prototypes of anti-gravity craft in the waning days of the war. The result? No working saucers, no interstellar alliances. But the myth endured. In the wreckage of the Reich, these ideas slipped underground into fringe science, post-war cults, and later, UFO subculture. The idea that Nazis made contact, that they escaped, that they were waiting somewhere beyond the ice, the clouds, the veil. Because if the gods were real, and if they came once, they might come again. But the Reich wasn't only looking up, they were digging down. To the coldest, most remote place on Earth, where silence reigns, and where they believed the final door might lie hidden in ice. Antarctica expeditions and New Swabia. At the bottom of the world, where the wind never stops screaming and the ice stretches into infinity, the Nazis believed they would find something unimaginable. Not just territory, not just resources, but access. To what? Everything. The Nazi obsession with Antarctica began quietly. Officially, it was a geopolitical expedition launched in 1938 under the name Neuschwabenland, New Swabia. A ship, the Schwabenland, was dispatched with planes, scientists, and surveyors. Their mission? Scout out areas for potential German whaling stations and lay the groundwork for future claims. Unofficially, they were hunting secrets. Theorists within the Ahnenerbe believed Antarctica might hide more than frozen mountains and penguins. They believed it might hold a lost entrance to the inner Earth, that beneath the ice lay ancient cities, alien structures, or the last remnant of Hyperoreia preserved by time and tectonics. And they weren't subtle about it. During the 1938-1939 expedition, Nazi pilots dropped aluminum darts emblazoned with swastikas across thousands of square kilometers of Antarctic territory. A surreal act of symbolic conquest staking claim to the coldest, most inaccessible terrain on Earth. They mapped vast stretches of Queen Maud land, gave it German names, set up temporary bases, and then vanished back into history. But the myth was just beginning. Post-war rumors exploded. Stories emerged first in whispers, then in pulp magazines, then in full-blown conspiracy lore that the Nazis hadn't just mapped Antarctica, they'd built something, a secret base, a subterranean fortress. Base 211. The narrative? As the war turned against Germany, select SS units, scientists, and Nazi elite fled Europeno to South America, but to the South Pole. They sailed aboard U-boats, carrying prototypes, documents, and perhaps even the Grail, the Spear of Destiny, or ancient technologies harvested from around the world. There, beneath the ice, in volcanic warm spots and underground caverns, they established a hidden Reich. Some say they discovered an ancient alien structure, already buried in Antarctica, perhaps Atlantean, perhaps Hyperborean, perhaps not of this Earth. Others claim they used that tech to construct advanced craft-flying discs powered by anti-gravity, Vril, or pure myth. The ultimate escape, the Fourth Reich in exile. Then came the stories of Operation High Jump. In 1946-47, the U.S. Navy launched a massive Antarctic mission led by Admiral Richard Byrd, officially, research and training. Unofficial, according to conspiracy theorists, it was an attempt to destroy the Nazi base. The operation was abruptly cut short. Byrd made cryptic comments about a new enemy, capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Fuel to the fire. The post-war era birthed a new breed of Nazi myth, the Nazi UFO. Sleek, black saucers allegedly powered by anti-gravity drives, seen darting through Arctic skies, witnessed in South America, even rumored to have engaged Allied aircraft in brief surreal encounters. And always, they were traced back to Antarctica, to New Swabia, to the final temple of the Third Reich. Of course, there's no hard evidence. No verified photos, no recovered craft, no base maps, just shadows, stories, and enough smoke to keep the internet ablaze for decades. But the core idea remained powerful. If the Nazis had discovered a new source of power, technological, spiritual, or both, then Antarctica wasn't just a hiding place. It was a launch pad, a new Atlantis, a frozen Avalon, a bunker for the rebirth of the myth. And if the myth was to return, it needed a foundation, a philosophy, a connection between land, blood, and memory, a mystical truth that turned farmland into sacred ground, the blood and soil mysticism. At first glance, it sounds like propaganda. Blood and soil, a slogan, a chant, a Nazi catchphrase screamed through rallies and stitched into the ethos of the Third Reich. But beneath the politics was something older, darker, spiritual. To the Nazis, blood and soil wasn't just ideology. It was mysticism, a metaphysical belief system that fused genetics and geography into a racial religion, a worldview in which the land itself held power, and that power was awakened only by those of the right blood. And the Nazis believed they had the map. This wasn't nationalism. This was ancestral geomancy. The idea: Aryan blood carries memory, energy, destiny. That blood pure, untainted resonates with specific lands. The forests of Germany, the mountains of the north, the meadows of the Rhine. Places that weren't just homes, they were wombs, altars. Himmler believed that the earth recorded history spiritually, that trauma, triumph, and lineage were absorbed by soil like ink on parchment, and that the right blood, Aryan blood, could read that history. Channel it. Draw power from it like a battery. This belief had deep roots in Volkisch thought, the 19th century German romanticism that glorified the peasant, the warrior farmer, the deep connection between a people and their land. It rejected industrialism and cosmopolitanism. It idealized the hearth, the heritage, the tribe, but the Nazis mutated it. They used it to justify conquest, arguing that wherever Aryan blood had once settled, that land was theirs by divine right. They called it Lebensraum, living space. But underneath that term lay an occult principle, that reclaiming land wasn't just politics. It was spiritual realignment. SS units were dispatched to scour Germany and beyond for ancient Germanic settlements, villages, burial mounds, ruined altars, sacred trees. These weren't archaeological missions, they were pilgrimages. The goal was to reconnect the bloodline to the soiline, to awaken racial memory. Some believed that by living on ancestral soil, a German could unlock latent potential, intuition, strength, even psychic abilities encoded in the DNA. This gave rise to bizarre rituals. Farms consecrated with rune ceremonies. Births recorded on ancestral calendars, aligned with the land's cycles. Marriages conducted on ancient holy sites where Germanic tribes once gathered. Graves unearthed not for history, but for spiritual inheritance. They didn't just want to rebuild Germany. They wanted to reroot it. Welsburg Castle itself was chosen not just for architecture, but for geography. Himmler believed it sat on a power point, a node in a forgotten geomantic grid that once connected the sacred sites of Aryan tribes. The castle was the heart, and the land surrounding it was the vein-work. Even agriculture wasn't spared. The Nazis created farming programs based on racial soil compatibility, theorizing that Aryan crops would flourish only under Aryan hands on Aryan land. Some SS documents even suggest experiments with soil purification, the idea that Earth itself could be tainted by non-Aryan presence and had to be ritually cleansed. It was madness. It was genocide wrapped in geomancy. A holy war fought with shovels and DNA charts. Because in this worldview, losing land wasn't just defeat. It was spiritual death. And reclaiming it wasn't victory, it was resurrection. But there was a larger cosmology behind it. The land was part of a trio world tree, one that connected the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. One that held all things. A tree they didn't invent, but one they were determined to possess. The Yggdrasil, world tree. At the center of Norse mythology stands a tree. Yggdrasil, a cosmic ash whose roots sink into the underworld and whose branches stretch across the heavens. It connects all realms, gods, men, monsters, fate, a structure not of wood but of existence. To most, it's myth. To the Nazis, it was a blueprint. They believed Yggdrasil wasn't just a story, it was a cosmic map, a diagram of racial, spiritual, and universal order. And if they could understand If, they could unlock its geometry, they could recreate the order of the world. Not metaphorically, literally. The Nazi esoteric obsession with Yggdrasil began with Karl Maria Willigut, Himmler's personal spiritual advisor. A delusional mystic who claimed to remember ancient Aryan history from 200,000 years ago. Willigut believed Yggdrasil was a real ancient structure, perhaps even an energy system left by the Hyperboreans. In his eyes, the tree was a cosmic hierarchy. At the top, the divine Aryan source. In the middle, mankind, struggling to return to its perfected state. At the roots, the enemy's chaos, degeneracy, races cut off from the tree. Willigut reimagined Yggdrasil not as a tree of life, but a racial filter. Only those with the right blood could climb its branches. Others? They withered at the root. And the SS? They were to become the trunk, the central pillar, upholding the rebirth of the world. Welsburg Castle was again at the heart. Himmler believed it to be the axis mundi, new center of the tree. The castle's north tower was the ritual spine, 12 rays, like branches, a black Sunday beneath the roots. The future above, the ancestors below. SS initiation rituals were modeled on symbolic ascent, moving through stages, chambers, and trials, like climbing the tree from Midgard to Asgard. Only the purest could reach the top. The Annerbe even sought physical symbols of the tree spirals, concentric rings, sacred groves, ancient stone circles. They believed these sites were echoes of Yggdrasil's energy grid on Earth. That by aligning themselves with these sacred coordinates, the SS could reconnect to the tree, not worship it, merge with it. They studied the 9 worlds of Norse lore and assigned racial, spiritual, and political meanings to each. Asgard, the goal, the seat of the divine Aryan. Midgard, the realm of man, tainted, needing purification. Niflheim and Hell, the fallen lands of decay, allegories for racial impurity and cultural decline. Some documents suggest the Nazis saw their global campaign as a cosmic pruning, cutting away the rot from Yggdrasil to allow the golden fruit to grow again. Willigut went further. He claimed the world tree had once been cut down, thousands of years ago, by corrupting forces, Judeo-Christianity, Roman imperialism, foreign bloodlines. The Reich, he believed, would replant it. The Black Sunday would nourish the roots. The SS would tend the branches. The gods would walk the earth once more. This wasn't just spiritual theater. It was cosmological engineering, a belief that reality itself was a structure, and that by rebuilding its symbolic skeleton, the Nazis could remake the world not in the name of faith, but of race. And if Yggdrasil was the skeleton, then they needed to fill its halls with the worthy dead. Which brings us to their most grotesque appropriation of Norse myth, the belief in a spiritual army, waiting in the halls of the gods. The Einherjar and Valhalla. In the echoing halls of Valhalla, the Norse believed, the chosen dead feasted and fought until the end of time. Not all warriors just, the Einherjar, the elite, the handpicked. Slain in battle, lifted by Valkyries, destined to rise again at Ragnarok, to fight for the gods in the final war. To most, this was myth, a poetic afterlife. To the Nazis, it was recruitment strategy. The concept of the Einherjar struck a dark chord with Nazi ideologues, especially Himmler, who viewed the SS as more than a military force. To him, the SS were the new Einherjara, spiritual brotherhood, bound by blood, death, and destiny. Warriors not just of the present, but of the eternal return. They weren't fighting for Hitler. They were fighting for the gods. SS propaganda began to mirror this myth. Fallen SS soldiers weren't just mourned, they were immortalized. Their deaths were seen not as loss, but as initiation into the next phase of war. Their names were recorded, honored, often associated with rune symbols, as if each man's death fed the root system of Yggdrasil. Welsburg Castle was again central. Its crypt wasn't just a tomb, it was meant to be a waiting room for the dead. A place where the souls of fallen SS leaders would linger, preserved through stone, ritual, and memory. Some even believed it was a literal soul bank, a spiritual power grid that would activate when the time was right. The design echoed Valhalla, circular, echoing, eternal. Rituals were performed to bind the dead to the cause. Names were carved. Ashes were kept. Ceremonies reenacted symbolic deaths and resurrections, preparing the living to die as heroes and return as gods. The SS wasn't just a military elite, it was a spiritual caste. An order of warrior priests, forging themselves through blood and flame to earn a place in myth. Their iconography, runes, black uniforms, sacred oaths was designed not just to terrify, but to transform. To shift the wearer's identity from man to myth. And in their death, they would become part of the legend. Just as the Einherjar would rise at Ragnarok, the Nazis believed their fallen would return during the next great cycle of rebirth, the next golden age. When the world burned, they would step forth again, armed not just with weapons, but with memory. This belief fed into ritual martyrdom. SS officers were taught to embrace death not as an end, but as a promotion. Dying in service to the Reich was not sacrifice, it was transcendence. Every death was a rehearsal for resurrection. It's no coincidence that as the war spiraled into defeat, this myth became more prominent. In desperation, the Reich leaned harder into delusion. If they couldn't win in this life, they would win in the next. Their soldiers would become ancestors. Their ideology, prophecy. Their failure, seed. And all of it was encoded in symbols, the secret alphabet of their imagined gods. Which brings us to the final twist in their sacred lie, the letters of their new language. The glyphs of madness and myth, the secrets of Germanic runes as a spiritual alphabet. Before alphabets, before Latin, before the Bible, there were runes. Jagged, stark, cut into wood, stone, and bone. Not just letter stools. Each stroke was a weapon, each word a spell. And to the Nazis, this wasn't history. It was destiny written in code. They didn't just adopt runes as symbols. They saw them as keystone, power, ancestry, consciousness. A sacred spiritual alphabet from a time when writing meant something. When carving a rune was an act of will. A summon. It began with the Armanen runes, a 19th century reinterpretation of ancient Germanic characters created by occultist Guido von List. He claimed these 18 runes were revealed to him during a period of blindness, visions of a lost Aryan magic system encoded in the language of the gods. The Nazis devoured it. Himmler, obsessed with runes, institutionalized them in the SS. Each symbol was given ritual, meaning purpose. They weren't decorations, they were invocations. The double sig rune, stylized lightning bolts, became the SS emblem. It stood for victory, the sun, power, a visible prayer for strength and domination. The Odal rune, heritage and blood, used to mark territories reclaimed by Aryan bloodlines. It became a symbol of racial land entitlement. The Tiwaz rune, the arrow, named for Tyr, god of war and sacrifice, worn on the gravestones of SS soldiers, symbolizing honor through death. And on and on. Awaz for resilience. Al-Jiz for protection. Hagalaz for destruction and rebirth. These were not academic meanings, they were magical formulas. Every rune had a vibrational frequency, a psychic charge. The Nazis believed chanting these runes in specific sequences could align the soul with ancient forces, activate ancestral memory, strengthen resolve, shield the body, or even influence events. They conducted rituals in rune circles, gatherings where initiates stood in symbolic formations, chanted the names, and traced the lines in the air. These weren't seances. They were acts of will. Wellsburg Castle was covered in runic iconography. Its north tower, the spiritual engine, was envisioned as a living sigil, channeling energy through geometry and glyph. The 12 seats around the Black Sunday floor, aligned to 12 runes, 12 aspects of spiritual warfare, a zodiac of death. Runes were carved into blades, stamped on documents, inked into skin, because for the SS, language was not passive. It was a weapon, a ritual, a claim. And they believed this spiritual alphabet was superior to all others. Latin was degenerate, Hebrew subversive, but runes? Runes were pure, prehistoric, divine. They didn't evolve from anywhere. They arrived. Some Nazi occultists claimed runes were not invented by humans, but received downloaded from ancient gods, alien minds, or higher dimensions. A sacred interface between the physical and the astral. If you wrote them correctly, you weren't just communicating, you were commanding. And when combined with the right blood, on the right land, under the right stars, you could reshape the world. But that's the tragedy. They carved these ancient symbols into mass graves. They painted the language of myth on torture chambers. They turned sacred letters into logos of terror. And when the Reich fell, the runes didn't die. They mutated. Still used, still twisted, still echoing. Because even the most ancient language, when spoken by monsters, can become a curse. And so ends the 50-fold descent into madness. 50 ancient, mysterious-twisted, stolen, weaponized by a regime that tried to stitch a new world out of lies, myth, and death. But remember, they didn't create these myths. They just ruined them. And now they lie shattered, scattered across the ruins of history, waiting, whispering, because the past never dies. It just waits for the next delusion, the end.